From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $9 billion studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. April 5, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Wrestlemania 15 Review, ESPN Outside the Lines Recap, tons more. By Observer staff. In what will likely prove to be the biggest revenue-grossing pro wrestling event in history, Steve Austin regained the WWF title at WrestleMania 15, a show far more notable for production and booking than for any of the wrestling. The basic consensus seemed to be a mild thumbs up for the show, although the reaction to this one was all across the board, as there were people who thought it was the best show in years and many who thought it was terrible. If a wrestling show is constituted by the quality of the matches from start to finish, then this was a thumbs down show with only 2 good matches tops out of 10. If it's based on surprises, booking and angles, it's a thumbs up. If it's based on crowd reaction to either and both, it wouldn't be a thumbs up since only the main event had good heat, and that's with a super hype job going in. If it's based on presenting well-produced television, it would be the best wrestling pay-per-view of the year. The biggest show of this and almost any other year on March 28 at the First Union Center in Philadelphia drew a sellout crowd of 18,274. Figure announced on the show was 20,276, which was 16,756 paid. All the tickets were gone months ago through advance mailing orders and none available to the general public at ticket outlets, paying $1,438,050 and another $274,384 in merchandise. The live gate would be the largest for a pro wrestling event in North America in 9 years, since the current record-setting $3.45 million house for WrestleMania 6 at Skydome in Toronto on April 1, 1990 for the Hogan vs. Warrior match, and the third largest ever in the United States, trailing WrestleMania 3 at the Pontiac Silverdome at $1,599,000 and WrestleMania 5 at Trump Plaza in Atlantic City at $1,628,000. The per head of $16.38 in merchandise would be one of the 2 or 3 highest ever for a pro wrestling event in North America, slightly trailing the $17.41 from last year's WrestleMania in Boston, and I believe there was an ECW pay-per-view show once that broke that mark. The pay-per-view was expected to break all existing records for both buys and revenue, with some estimates before the event that it would do 1 million buys, a figure no pay-per-view event aside from major boxing matches have ever done. But more important than the revenue records are what this exactly means to the future direction of this industry. Wrestling used to be shooting angles and creating soap opera storylines on television with the idea of them paying off in dollars for when the matches are blown off on pay-per-view. Today, the people want to see the angles and the storylines, but the matches don't interest them. On this show, despite all the hype, the crowd reactions were weak. From various different live sources there were different impressions, most saying it was dead except for the main event and the big spots, others saying the crowd reactions were good but it didn't come across as well on television. This was one of the biggest shows in many ways in the history of the industry. It's always better to have a sellout house in a 15,000-seat building making no noise than 1,500 people in a 15,000-seat building, or even a 1,500-seat building, that are screaming their lungs out, which is why in many ways pops and crowd reactions are totally misleading. Over who and when a product is over is based on crowd reactions to this show. Nobody except Austin, Vince and Rock were all that over. But the fact was, the product and every key player involved is very much over. It's probably time to revamp exactly what pay-per-view is. Not as far as how to hype it because the shows are selling very well, but what is offered. Pay-per-view should have a lot of quick, fast-paced matches like on television, a lot of interviews and angles leading to a few main events played out before the crowd that are given time to build because that's what the show is built around. For all the undercard hype, it was clear the fans paid largely for the main event and were bored by the length of the prelim matches even when the action in the ring was fast-paced and looked good. Another thing, and this goes for most WWF pay-per-view events and also for Nitro, is that the nature of the first hour of the show is a killer to the rest of the show. With the heat lead-in, the first hour at every live event consists of short bad matches and far too much talk. It's pretty well established a 4-hour show is too long, but the nature of the beats necessitates it this time. By the time the pay-per-view starts, the crowd has already dulled from its festive mood and is largely waiting for the 1 or 2 big matches. For Nitro, it's the same story of late with the dead first hour, unfortunately booked so heavy on packages killing the crowd for the rest of the show. I'd say it's better to put on several short matches early, but for WWF, that's a problem too, because there is no talent depth. For wrestling, ECW's show last week blew this one away, and its top two matches were equal to the main event on this show. Its bad matches weren't as bad, and overall it had a better undercard. WCW's was the best show of the month when it comes to start-to-finish wrestling and blew the other two shows away for crowd heat. Strangely, WCW is the promotion that seemingly is dying when it comes to momentum, and the ratings do tell that story. But Wrestlemania will end up far more memorable. The Austin title win was expected going in, but given away as late in the show. Michael Cole made an announcement before the match started, that after the event on the Home Shopping Network that the new champ Steve Austin would appear. And the only thing on the show that wasn't controlled, the Brawl for All concept was probably knocked into the grave and told to rest in peace when gimmick boxer Butterbean devastated the reputation made by Bart Gunn last year in literally seconds. And speaking of resting in peace, the reputation of the Hell in the Cell match was expected to be tested by putting Undertaker vs. Big Boss Man in. As it was, this one, despite Double Juice, got considerable support for worst match on the show, and that's on a show which included easily the worst major promotion match of the year in Sable vs. Tori. The one thing this show emphasized is that if WWF goes through with its plans for a women's wrestling show on UPN next season, it had better be heavy on the writing and skits and keep the wrestling segment short. The other thing this show brought out that probably nobody realized is how good a worker Luna Vachon must have been, because Terry Power is a decent worker, although her hard physical Japan style and what WWF and Sable would want out of this are a complete style clash. The subtitle of this match was clearly Sable Exposed. On the upside, the work of Shane McMahon in his European title match with X-Pac was very good for someone with so little time wrestling in front of crowds. McMahon was clearly way ahead of most first-timers, although he did benefit from being in the ring with the best worker in the company and apparently had trained hard for the match. He actually had the second best match on the show, and while some of it was with the smoke and mirrors of a lot of outside distractions, at no point did he look out of place in the ring. He blew away most of the big athletic and entertainment stars put in as guests in recent years, with the exception of Kevin Green and possibly Lawrence Taylor, and even the likes of his father, who may have had as good an actual match but really couldn't work in the ring, Eric Bischoff and David Flair. There are plenty of people who have trained for years that are thrust into the major leagues, and most don't do this well the first time out. The Heat show opened with Vince ordering the main event as a no DQ match. Please don't try to use logic on how that rule benefits the champion, but the announcers were explaining this as stacking the deck against Austin. Paul White said he was going to guard the door to make sure Austin didn't get in. Jacqueline Moore pinned Ivory Tina Moretti in 124 after a back suplex. Terry Runnels came out, back with her cigar gimmick. Ivory can't work at all. Runnels, who did commentary, can't talk at all. Terrible, but it was kept short. After the match, Runnels burned Ivory with a cigar until Tori ran in for the save. Kevin Kelly told kids at home not to copy the moves of these trained professionals. I wish he'd have said this after a match with two trained professionals. D'Lo Brown and Tess split a 21-man battle royal, with the winners getting a tag title shot at WrestleMania in 4/16. Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett did commentary with Deborah there for Eye Candy. Order of elimination was Public Enemy, Viscera, Gilbert, Animal, 8-Ball Skull, Hawk, Scott Taylor, Farouk, Tiger Ali Singh, Matt Hardy, Jeff Hardy, Midian, Brian Christopher, Steve Blackman, Bradshaw, and then Godfather and Draws went out together. It was a typical Titanic battle royal. You know, everyone jumps overboard as quick as they can. Jeff Hardy took a good bump, but he was the only one. The only redeeming quality was Owen Hart on commentary, and I'm not sure if it was sarcasm or he was just so bad, but he was cracking me up when Singh went out and he said, "There goes the great Hindu star Tiger Ali Singh," because the line was delivered so out of the 70s. Even better was just before the finish, Hart was talking about how fatigue was setting in because these men have been fighting for more than 20 minutes. It was just before the 4 minutes mark of the match. Hart and Jarrett jumped Brown and Test after the match. Bossman did an interview, but the lights went out, and Undertaker's voice did an interview. It would up with the Brood hitting the ring with the lights out, and Bossman got the bloodbath. Mankind showed up and he and White began a backstage brawl, allowing Austin to walk through the door. The big show began with Boys II Men singing America the Beautiful and a great video piece setting the show up, narrated by Fred Blassie. Actually, that video piece may have been the single best thing on the show. 1. Bob Holly, Robert Howard, regained the Hardcore title in a three-way match over Billy Gunn, Monty Sopp, and Al Snow, Alan Sarvin, in 7:06. Crowd was deadly early until Snow pulled a hockey stick from under the ring, which elicited a "Let's Go Flyers" chant. Snow broke the hockey stick on Holly's back and a broomstick over Gunn's back. Snow also hit both with head to set up, bringing a table in. Gunn hit Snow with a chair and threw him through a table. Gunn used the rocker dropper, which has gone from being the Fame-asser, which no doubt was about to get nicknamed the Flame-asser, to the Famouser, on Snow and went for the pin. Holly saved Snow and jumped on and got the 3 to win the title. 1 1/4 stars. 2. Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett retained the WWF Tag Titles, beating Brown, A.C. Connor, and Test, Andrew Martin, in 3:58. Ivory came out wearing clothes and a Band-Aid on her face. The Band-Aid was about the size of the outfit she wrestled in earlier in the show. Deborah came out in a white bikini. Must have been a sweltering hot day in downtown Philadelphia. No heat, but this was a fast-paced, well-wrestled match, with Hart and Brown in particular looking good. Finish saw Brown set up a power bomb on Jarrett, but Hart nailed him with a missile dropkick and Jarrett used a jackknife cradle for the pin. Test's head was somewhere else, so Ivory slapped him, which led to Brown and Test fighting after the match. 1 1/4 stars. 3. Butterbean, Eric Esch, knocked out Bart Gunn, Mike Polchlepik, in 35 seconds of the first round in a brawl for all shoot match. So much for Gunn as a pro boxer. Gunn never tried to take Butterbean down, and it was clear in the first exchange that Gunn was in dangerously over his head. Butterbean knocked him down at 20 seconds and Gunn barely made it to his feet at 9. He was then knocked out when he got up with his neck snapping as he fell on the ropes. It really looked dangerous. Butterbean may be considered a joke in boxing circles, but he still does it for a living, and even 40 fights against largely handpicked opponents is still worlds apart from Gunn knocking out pro wrestlers that have never boxed in their lives. After the match, the San Diego Chicken ran in and referee Vinny Pacienza punched him in the beak and he went down. The crowd groaned as that spot was really lame, especially coming on the heels of such a brutal real knockout. Before the match, when they announced the judges, they brought out Gorilla Monsoon, which I believe was his first appearance before the public at a show since his health problems. He's lost a ton of weight, but he got one of the biggest pops of the show. He looked almost moved by the reaction. 4. Mankind, Michael Foley, beat Paul White via DQ in 6:50. Mankind pulled out Sacco and put on the claw 3 times, but White broke it every time. The one good spot was Mankind on White's back and White falling backwards on him. White hit Mankind with a chair to the stomach and a hard chair shot to the back. He then choke slammed Mankind onto 2 chairs, more like in the middle between them, and the ref DQ'd him. Mankind's knee must be really bad because he didn't do much. White didn't do much either. Vince came out and yelled at White about screwing up and not being the ref. White picked McMahon up for a choke slam, but then let him down. Vince continued to berate him by saying, "I'm Vince McMahon and you're a nobody," and finally slapped him. White punched him and left him for dead. Vince was helped out by Patterson and Briscoe. Mankind did a stretcher job and was said to have been taken to the hospital. I think that happens on every WWF pay-per-view now, where a guy is taken to the hospital and returns for the end of the show. 3/4 star. 5. Road Dogg Brian James retained the IC title in a 4-way over Ken Shamrock, Goldust, Dustin Runnels, and Val Venus, Sean Morley, in 9:47. The action was decent and it was fast-paced, but aside from Road Dogg's dancing in the ring, nothing got much of a reaction. There was nothing wrong with this match, but the lack of heat made it seem dead, and the weak finishes hurt as well. Venus and Goldust traded near falls, including Goldust kicking out of the fisherman suplex. Venus did the spot where he's dazed and fell headfirst into Goldust's groin, and did it a zillion times better than Vince and Stevie Ray did it uncensored. Shamrock DDT'd Goldust while Dog DDT's Venus, so they were both out. Shamrock eventually got the ankle lock on Venus, who got a rope break. The two brawled out of the ring for a weak double count-out finish. Shamrock hit both Goldust and Dog with a belly-to-belly. Ryan Shamrock tried a low blow on Goldust but somehow didn't hit it. Goldust hit Dog with a power slam, but in doing so, Dog maneuvered him into a small package for the pin. 1 1/2 star. Paul White was arrested at this point. This was a spoof of the deal in Memphis where they brought out an entire police force because the guy is so huge. There were like 24 officers and they put him in the back of a squad car and drove him off. 6. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, in 11:33 via DQ. Before the match, the Chicken came back and attacked Kane. Kane pulled off his headpiece, revealing Pete Rose, and gave him another of those tombstone piledrivers where Rose's head didn't come within a foot of the canvas. Helmsley took over with a low blow. Helmsley took some really good bumps, but this was overall a boring match with little heat. Kane actually did a running dive over the top. A lot of the offense from both men looked weak. Helmsley got out of the tombstone and Kane got out of the pedigree. Chyna threw the stairs into the ring and Kane picked them up, but Helmsley dropkicked the stairs into his face. Kane really didn't sell it well. They did a drop toe hold into the steps spot, which was good. They did a hot spot where Triple H went for the pedigree while standing on the ring steps, but Kane reversed him and Triple H took a backdrop all the way to the floor. Kane in the ring finally hit the choke slam. Before he could go for the pin, Chyna grabbed a chair and told Kane she wanted to hit Triple H. Of course you could see what was going to happen next. Chyna hit Kane with the chair for the DQ. After the match, Triple H used the pedigree on Kane, dropping him onto a chair. The crowd popped big to see Triple H and Chyna back together. 1 1/4 stars. At this point Vince said he'd be the ref for the main event. 7. Sable, Rena Mero, pin Tori Terry Pac. In 5:06. Absolutely the worst match of the year. Tori came out in a bodysuit that was airbrushed to make it look like she had no clothes on. Tori didn't have a chance to do what she knows. They were blowing every spot and couldn't work together at all. People at ringside could hear Sable loudly complaining in the ring that Tori was hurting her and being too stiff. Tori did a crossbody, knocking out ref Jimmy Corderas. Sable set up the powerbomb, but Tori was supposed to land on her feet. Like everything else in the match, that didn't happen. Nicole Bass hit the ring about 30 seconds early for the run-in and pressed Tori and dropped her, leading to the Sable bomb win. -2 stars. 8. Shane McMahon pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, to retain the European title in 8:41. Patterson and Briscoe tried to attack X-Pac before the match, and you know what happened to them. Test came out with Shane to offer the smoke and mirrors. They focused as well as the Mean Street Posse, Shane's high school friends. Test crotched X-Pac into the post. Shane missed the corporate elbow and hit a low blow. He started whipping X-Pac with the belt several times and hard. He also took a good bump over the top and X-Pac hit a pescado. In the funniest spot, X-Pac hit 3 of Shane's friends at ringside with punches and all 5 went down. After Test interfered again, Shane went to the top. X-Pac swept his leg and he crotched himself on the top and was superplexed into the ring. Test saved the pin. Test went after X-Pac again, but he moved and Test went into the steps. X-Pac came back with very good belt shots and kicks. Shane took a real believable bump from a spin kick into the corner. Shane missed a Bronco Buster and X-Pac laid out Test. Triple H and Chyna ran out. After X-Pac used the X-Factor on Shane, Triple H ran in, and while Chyna distracted the ref, Triple H gave X-Pac the pedigree, allowing Shane to win and keep the title. The Outlaws came out, but Triple H and Test were laying them out until Kane's music played and everyone scattered. 2 3/4 stars. 9. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, in the Hell in a Cell match in 9:46. This was a calamity of a match. Boss Man pulled out handcuffs and cuffed Taker to the cage. He delivered a few nightstick shots when the gimmicked handcuffs broke way too early. This left poor Undertaker in the embarrassing position of having to stay in the position and pretend to be helpless and trapped while Bossman continued the planned beating. Taker juiced. He got a chair and delivered hard shots to Bossman's back and threw him into the cage. Bossman bladed. The Philadelphia crowd didn't react one iota to the blood. Really loud, boring chants. The finish was a tombstone out of nowhere. After the match, the Brood came from the ceiling a la Sting and dropped a noose through the cage. Taker put the noose around Bossman's head and Paul Bearer with this remote control box lifted the cage. Bossman was literally being hung and acting as if he passed out. They went to a video feature and nothing was ever said about it again. I guess this really is a Roadrunner cartoon. I think maybe this was the spot where they should have told kids not to try and imitate this stuff at home. Dud. 10. Steve Austin Steve Williams regained the WWF title, pinning Rock, Dwayne Johnson, in 1652. Jim Ross was brought out to announce the main event and got a big ovation. He didn't do any of the parody of himself stuff that he did when he announced Raw 2 weeks ago, or any of the act where he had been made to look like he'd gone postal. I guess that angle is forgotten, and thank God for that. Vince came out to referee. Shawn Michaels came out to a huge pop saying that wasn't going to happen. I guess we're not supposed to remember the deal that Michaels was hired but would have no authority over anything having to do with Austin. Michaels banned the corporation from ringside but did basically say Vince could do a run-in if he wanted to later, although not in those words, but pretty well telegraphed that spot. He brought out Mike Ciota to ref. You could see where that was going. The two guys worked real hard, brawling outside the ring, with Austin in particular taking some nasty bumps. You have to give him credit working as hard as he does, considering he doesn't have to and would be just as over if he did a half-assed job. They did a hell of a brawl, including Austin taking a backdrop on the lighting fixtures with his bad knee landing on it. He choked Rock with a cord. Rock suplexed Austin on the floor. They traded spitting water at each other. Austin went to put Rock through the Spanish announcer's table. This spot has become a cliché, but it didn't break on the first try, so he jumped off the barricade onto Rock on the table, and it broke the second time. Rock wrapped Austin's knee around the post. Austin whipped Rock into the steps. Rock used the rock bottom for a near fall. Austin KO'd Ciota with a chair when Rock put the ref in the way. Rock used the chair to the knee and a hard chair shot to the head. Tim White ran into ref and you could see what was going to happen next. Rock did a Samoan drop for a near fall. When Austin kicked out, Rock delivered the rock bottom on White, so he was done. Austin hit the stunner, but no ref. Earl Hebner ran in, but Rock kicked out. Vince attacked Hebner. Guess he was mad about still paying him that big contract 18 months later. Vince and Rock were double-teaming Austin when Mankind ran in and decked Vince. Austin did a schoolboy for a cool near fall. Rock delivered another rock bottom but missed the corporate elbow. He went for another rock bottom, but Austin blocked it and hit the stunner for the pin. After the match, Earl Hebner, who seemed way more excited about Austin about winning the title, drank beer in the ring with Austin. Austin decked Vince after the match and delivered another stunner and poured beer on him to end the show. This was a really good main event, but not at the level of heat of their Raw match last year or even their tag match in San Jose 2 weeks ago. 3.5 stars. If there was anything the ESPN Outside the Line special on March 30th on the pro wrestling industry brought home, it was that nobody learned anything as to what it was that nearly brought this industry to its knees 7 years ago. In many ways it was some of the same cast of characters, doing the same thing, only making more money than ever before. It is almost as if they don't seem to understand this only makes them bigger targets than ever before from a media that is both far more understanding of the subject than it was 7 years ago. And unlike that period, wrestling is no longer dismissed as this insignificant fake sport business beneath discussion in many circles. It is part of day-to-day life and it's discussed regularly on mainstream shows. The award-winning investigative series hosted by Bob Lay has spent the past few months on the wrestling beat, and besides giving a background on what wrestling is and how it's set up, also gave credit to the performers for their athletic ability and ability to play with pain, in particular Mick Foley, who came out as one of the few people with a socially redeeming side in the piece, and then talked about its effect on young children, its turning a blind eye to the use of steroids and other drugs, and finally the end result, the preponderance of early deaths among pro wrestlers, focusing mainly on Brian Pillman and Louis Spicolli. The piece started as this portrayal of a nice little entertainment event, showing bookers for Tony Rumble's NWA New England promotion at a booking meeting, and then showed the card, held March 13th in Southbridge, Massachusetts, where Rumble gave orders backstage from what was decided at the meeting to the talent, and showing them play out those orders before the fans at a minor league wrestling show showing young children clad in WWF paraphernalia, with smiles on their faces. But where it ended was a lot uglier. The death of Brian Pillman. In a stunner, it was revealed that over the last 18 months of his life, Pillman would take a shot a day of human growth hormone. That was hardly the only drug he was using at the time of his death, as Pillman used heavy doses of painkillers because his ankle was so badly damaged, had done decadurabolin, an anabolic steroid, to stack with the HGH to create a dual effect of adding muscle, being an undersized man in a big man's company and being unable to train his lower body due to his injuries. He was also using cocaine at the time of his death. Officially, Pillman died of an enlarged heart, which gave out. Any of these or all of these could have led to the death. Pillman, it was revealed, had been getting HGH from the Palm Springs Life Extension Institute and Dr. Edmund Chen, with the show producing receipts for several $400 purchases from the clinic. The former Melanie Pillman said Brian had began using the drug based on a connection with Chen made on a recommendation from Hulk Hogan. Earlier in the piece, Hogan had admitted steroid use earlier in his career but had claimed to be clean, but said it still existed in wrestling. A second source, who was not revealed, said that Hogan had told him and steered numerous other wrestlers toward Dr. Chen. Hogan spokespeople denied he even knew Dr. Chen, very similar to their reactions in 1991 when Hogan's name surfaced in the Zarian investigation and Hogan claimed not to know Zarian and the only connection is that they once had a fan photo taken together, while Chen claimed that he had never prescribed HGH to an athlete, although the receipt pretty much contradicted that. The scariest part of all is that the clinic is currently having all its records investigated by the FDA, which almost sounds like a Zarian waiting to happen. Tina Mucciolo, the younger sister of Louis Spicolli, was shown on camera talking about how her brother, who lived in San Pedro, near Los Angeles, would drive to Tijuana regularly and buy somas, which are legal over-the-counter drugs in Mexico, and smuggle them across the border and provide them to other wrestlers when he would go on road trips. Rob Van Dam was interviewed for the piece and said to have been a good friend of Spicoli's and a pallbearer at his funeral, and claimed to have flushed his supply of somas down the toilet after Spicoli's death, with a teary-eyed Mucciolo just hoping that if the lessons learned from her brother's death were to save the life of one person, his death wouldn't have been in vain. It was noted that Spicoli didn't learn the lessons from the death of Pillman just a few months earlier. In between were segments on the impact of pro wrestling on young children, which, quite frankly, may have been far more powerful than the revelation of the ugly tangled web behind the Pillman death. Unlike the segment on pro wrestling turning its back on the steroid problem, which targeted both WWF and WCW with Eric Bischoff coming off nervous and evasive and Vince McMahon coming across arrogant and deceptive, this segment was aimed at the WWF Raw show specifically. The very items that are part of the package that has made Raw the most popular show on cable, has also made it so controversial because of the larger number of very young children who watch the show. ESPN aired the most graphic scenes, including the attempted castration of Val Venus, called by Mick Foley as a low point of the show but then defended by McMahon, who defended it because there was no actual castration, and the simulated blowjob by the transvestite on Mark Henry, playing the tape in front of McMahon, who attempted some very contrived laughter as his defense, which only made him come off worse. They showed a 13-year-old student who had been suspended from school 3 times for telling girls in his class to suck it. They showed a kindergartner suspended, and when asked what suck it meant, said it meant to suck his private parts. They noted in the same school that 4 6th graders were suspended for copying scenes from the Raw show. Dr. Brian O'Connell, a high school principal in Buffalo, called the show a nationwide monster that's got to be stopped. McMahon defended his product, saying that people, if they don't like it, should switch the channel. Several other parents from the Buffalo school were shown in sound bites basically batting McMahon's quotes out of the park. It was noted that while the show is rated TV 14 now, it was rated TV PG up through 1 month ago. The NYPD Blue and daytime soap opera argument was batted out because kids aren't going to school talking about those shows, nor do those shows draw any kind of an under 12 demographic, nor do they advertise and market directly to children, and neither show airs simulated blowjobs on television. The argument that most of the graphic scenes air after 10 p.m. was not addressed, being that in so many markets the show much earlier than 10 p.m. than it does on the East Coast and on the West Coast of the U.S. Canada doesn't have a dual feed, so the West Coast of Canada actually sees the second hour of Raw beginning at 6 p.m. McMahon saying there is no using knives as a weapon was blown to bits, showing a ministry angle where it appeared a body was being carved open with a knife. McMahon did admit marketing to children, although also said he thought the Mark Henry transvestite blowjob angle was totally inappropriate for a 9-year-old after airing a soundbite of a 9-year-old who watched it and attempted to explain what it is. His argument that the morning shows are more geared for children but not the Raw show was blown away since the same scenes air on both shows, and that the morning shows are used primarily to build angles specifically to increase the ratings on Raw. The argument that parents should monitor the show, which is the WWF's lone argument that doesn't fall apart under even minor scrutiny, was blown away by a parent saying that they could monitor their children watching, but they can't monitor every child in the school watching. This, even more than the deaths, made the industry look sleazy. The show opened with signs of how popular pro wrestling is. This piece pretty well portrayed Bill Goldberg as the biggest star in wrestling but showed clips of many of the other biggest names as well, showing clips of him from his football career to the Illinois Lottery commercial to speaking before Congress on animal rights. Both Wally Skrzybiak and Karl Malone were shown talking about pro wrestlers as great athletes. The claimed 21 of the top 25 shows on cable in February were pro wrestling shows. That's using the misleading stat of counting every episode of Raw and Thunder as 2 shows and every episode of Nitro as 3. That 40 million people per week watch the show. I was just this past week working with CBS Evening News for an upcoming segment on that same figure, and we got a figure of 22 million viewers, and that's counting many viewers several times off or watching multiple shows as the total cable audience, so I'd guess you couldn't make a case for more than about 26 million. And the $1 billion industry estimates which we've got into in the past, and while it makes a great opening statement, at this point both WWF and WCW have admitted their gross revenues for a year to be in the $200 million range. It also had a piece on the background of some wrestlers, noting Kevin Nash as a college basketball player, Goldberg as an NFL player, Randy Savage as a minor league baseball player, and Rock as a college football player. The piece praised Mick Foley for being legendary in the profession for his ability to take punishment, including showing clips of his matches both in the WWF and Japan. Foley talked about the 1970 NBA playoff finals when Willis Reed came out to lead the Knicks to the championship in the 7th game while limping on a bad ankle, and his remembrances of that as a kid growing up, and how what he and other wrestlers have done when it comes to playing with serious injuries puts that to shame. At the end of the piece, Lay noted that pro wrestlers may be the hardest working athletes in any sports, wrestling up to 200 matches per year in different cities every night with no off-season, but noted there is a scary dark side to the profession as well. The steroid piece opened with clips from a 1994 story on Billy Graham, noting he had just underwent another hip replacement surgery. It then moved to Portland, Oregon, noting it was one of the largest markets in the country, number 22 market, but that neither WWF nor WCW had run there since 1993, and tied it to the fact Oregon has legitimate drug testing for pro wrestlers under its Boxing and Wrestling Commission. McMahon was totally misleading, acting as if that wasn't the reason they don't run Oregon. And it isn't entirely the reason, saying they run other states that have drug testing procedures, which is true in a sense that other states have drug testing for boxers that WWF runs in, but they don't run in any states that do regular independent drug testing of pro wrestlers. And when a bill was debated in the Florida legislature a few years ago that would have mandated steroid testing of all pro wrestlers, both WWF and WCW threatened to pull out of the state if the bill went through. Although the piece was on steroids, it should have noted that even Oregon doesn't test for steroids, but does test for drugs that would impair someone's ability to perform in the ring without endangering their dance partner, such as cocaine. They noted that last year WCW had booked the Rose Garden for an event, but 12 days after the commission sent WCW its drug testing procedures, which are actually less stringent than the policies WCW is supposed to have in place, WCW canceled the date. Bischoff was shown, looking real bad, saying he had no idea why they pulled the date. An official from the Rose Garden, the building that WCW booked, said WCW officials made it clear they were pulling out over the issue of drug testing. It also noted officials from the building are trying to get legislation passed in Oregon to discontinue drug testing wrestlers as a means to get WWF and WCW to run shows in their building. Bret Hart talked about having done steroids earlier in his career in the WWF, saying at that time you almost had to. Buff Bagwell came up with a lame argument that unless you've been in the gym for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 15 years, that you have no right to ask him if he takes steroids. Scott Steiner flexed his arms while denying steroid use, but they showed clips of fans at the Nitro in Cincinnati chanting steroids and holding up steroid posters directed at both of them. Both McMahon and Bischoff came off worse. Bischoff portrayed steroids as a PR problem, which caused ESPN to make him look bad with the statement, and Dr. Gary Wadler, a steroid expert who was the government expert witness in the trials of Zarian, McMahon and Dr. Walter Jecko, so note if it's being addressed as a PR problem, then it's not being addressed. Bischoff said many wrestlers have tested positive for steroids on a regular basis, but couldn't put an estimate on how many there would be, only stating they have suspended 6 wrestlers for steroids in the last 3 years. Vince gave the argument that the public doesn't care, giving the TV guideline that is going to bite him in the ass when the next death comes, since he's just coming off a death, as it surely will someday, about reasonable cause for testing being when he sees a syringe on a guy. This made him look that much worse by the end of the piece, since drug problems that I don't want to say were ignored because they weren't, but they were also not addressed in hindsight to a strong enough degree, most likely played a part in the death of Pillman, and Spicoli's death brought about zero change in this industry. Bret Hart stated that he didn't see painkillers as that big of a problem in any individuals, but said they probably would be again at some point. Chris Jericho said he didn't think steroids should be an issue. Kevin Nash said that he didn't think the use of painkillers was a bigger problem in wrestling than in any other sport, about the only point McMahon made which was valid, which is actually not a logical defense of pro wrestling, but it is a point in sports people condemning pro wrestling for its lack of addressing the problem, is that neither Major League Baseball nor the National Hockey League test for steroids. All these arguments might even hold water as it pertains to this subject if athletes in those sports died at the same rate as pro wrestlers. Those in the industry will try and knock this show as being a negative piece. And it was. But it was a fair piece that made every attempt to be balanced, and gave both sides of every issue. What wrestlers do in the ring, the risks they take, and how they get up for more was portrayed in a very positive light, and they were portrayed as being great athletes, which many of them are and some of them aren't. When a fair and balanced piece is a negative piece, and when quotes of people in the industry wind up being blown out like walking in minefields, the industry needs to look at itself, which it never does, and why the problems never get addressed. Admittedly, most sports and entertainment producers are no different. And as popular as wrestling has become, unless it cleans up its act on the marketing to children and the drug issues, it is hardly going to be the last piece of this type. In 1992, this industry, when confronted with many real problems, tried to lie and pretend and mislead and double talk, rather than face the fact that a problem existed. The industry had 3 bad years in near quicksand, Not to mention two major federal trials, with both major companies losing money at the rate of nearly $5 million per year. It escaped from the quicksand, and with its latest prosperity being greater than ever before has totally forgotten what put it in the quicksand to begin with. There is no reason it ever needs to be in quicksand again, because history should show exactly what quicksand is. Unfortunately, based on this show, one company is run by someone who is walking around thinking quicksand is some PR problem that they can pretend to address in a fake PR manner and look vapid in doing so. The other is run by someone who is so successful, he thinks he can walk through quicksand without getting muddy, and unfortunately is surrounded by people, both real and in storyline, who tell him as he continues to walk through muddy waters on one show after another, that he's never gotten the slightest bit dirty when in fact he's been swimming in filth. Somebody needs to wake both companies up and tell them how this story turned out last time, and how it will again this time unless something real is done. Oh, it'll turn out a mess a few times this year when shows like this air, but that's just bad PR and it won't hurt the precious ratings. It's the bodies that will be buried in the quicksand, and the lessons not learned in the quest for those precious ratings that means a whole lot more than a year filled with PR black eyes. Nitro didn't stink this week, but the ratings sure did. Going against a record-setting Raw one day after WrestleMania, the final score for this week's destruction was a 17.2 rating for the Connecticut Duke NCAA basketball championship game, which is well above what Monday Night Football averaged in the fall, 6.51, 6.62 first hour, 6.40 seconds hour, setting a new all-time record for Raw, which was a 9.6 share, and 3.51 for Nitro, 4.27 first hour, 3.12 seconds hour, 3.17 third hour, which was a 5.2 share. It is almost a sure bet that had there not been such stiff network competition, that Raw would have done roughly a 7.0 rating and broken every mark in history, and that when Nitro gets preempted when the NBA goes to the playoffs, that 7.0 barrier will probably be broken. The gap in quality between the two shows was tighter than it had been in recent weeks, although WWF still had the edge because of its writing, whereas WCW lives and dies by star power with no stories and cold match quality. But WCW is paying dearly for the sins of the past month, particularly the destruction of the unopposed hour, with one bad show after another, and this rating, as the first hour dying shows, was more due to the poor show last week in Panama City, causing even more people to have given up on the product. The destruction of the first hour, to the point where the announcers were now told to talk about Nitro actually starting at 9 p.m., so the first hour is considered a pre-game show even though it's the hour that delivers the biggest audience and it's still thrown away, was finally evident this week. In the battle of main events in the final quarter, WWF with X-Pac vs Triple H drew a 6.47, while Nitro with Hogan vs Page drew a 2.85, which I guess shows not to be fooled by the size of the crowd pop that Hogan got because he died out there. In the overrun, the final angle involving Austin Rock, Shane McMahon, Triple H and Paul White drew a 6.78 rating, while the climax of Hogan vs Page did a 3.12, and even that number is misleading because Nitro had about 90 seconds unopposed after Raw going off, so the realistic head-to-head in the overrun was probably about a 2.7. Raw's peak rating was a 7.02 for the Sable and Jacqueline vs Ivory and Tori match, which probably more than anything else tells about the current tastes among wrestling fans, making it one of the 5 most watched matches ever on cable television. Nitro opened head-to-head at 3.6, which isn't that much lower than it has opened with in recent weeks, for the angle involving Flair, Hogan and Page to set up the main event. However, it died with a 2.7 for Rick Steiner vs Norton and a 2.8 for Booker T vs Chris Adams. The only thing that could even remotely be called positive when it came to WCW's ratings was the performance of Bret Hart, whose quarters did a 3.4 and 3.8, but even they lost to Steve Williams vs Bob Holly at 6.1, and Rock vs Billy Gunn at 6.2. Most of the controversy surrounding the Vince McMahon appearance and Phil Mushnick non-appearance on the Fox on Sports show on March 21st on the Fox News Network appears to have been cleared up, but perhaps not all. But the basics of the story appeared to be the same. In several discussions this week with WWF Vice President of Marketing Jim Byrne, who set up the appearance, and Craig Thomas, the senior producer of the show, including a three-way conversation, this is how the points of contention appear to be. Burns claimed that Vince McMahon agreed to do the show only because he was promised a face-to-face confrontation with Phil Mushnick, which was disputed by the hosts of the show along with Mushnick because, according to all, the timing of everything made that statement a lie. The timing did in fact make this point untrue. Fox on Sports asked McMahon to come on the show the week the University of Indiana study came out. McMahon's people told them he was busy that Sunday, but they agreed at that point on a March 21st date. It was several weeks later before Mushnick was even asked to do the show. Byrne now said what he meant to say was that once Mushnick agreed to do the show, at that point McMahon's reasons for doing the show changed. On the day he came, it was specifically to debate Mushnick. Byrne claimed Mushnick would be there live and was never told differently, while hosts Brian Kilmeade and Wally Matthews said at no point was Mushnick ever booked to be there live. Both sides on this were true. According to Thomas, there was in fact no point when Mushnick ever agreed he would be in the studio, and from the start it was agreed it would be a phone-in interview. However, Thomas did say that another producer of the show, Michael Skritzinski, did at one point tell Byrne that Mushnick would be in the studio live and that nobody from the station ever told anyone at Titan differently, and that they had been the ones who screwed up. Matthews said that Titan knew Mushnick wouldn't be there live on March 11th isn't true. Matthews himself actually thought, since that was the day he found out and also the day the producers were to relay the message to Titan of that fact. For reasons that nobody has been able to explain other than the producers admitting being at fault, the message was never relayed. Whether my name was ever brought up to Titan Sports and nixed from the show, Thomas said that the names of Lou Albano and of the child behavior psychologist were brought up to Byrne on March 19th, and both were nixed. Byrne said they were nixed because McMahon wanted a one-on-one with Mushnick and claimed the behavioral psychologist was friends with Mushnick. Thomas said that they picked the behavioral psychologist at random out of a book and that Mushnick didn't know the person, a story that Mushnick confirmed, and that Albano would turn the segment into a joke. Thomas said they claimed in the conversation that they didn't have enough time to prepare at that later date for any other guests. Thomas said that he couldn't explain why my name wouldn't have been brought up to Titan, even to suggest the most logical explanation that when they insisted on no other guests, it was needless to bring up any other names. Kilmeade, who was the one who asked me to do the show, was told the other guests, which he was to believe would have meant myself and the behavior psychologist, were nixed because Titan claimed McMahon didn't have enough time to prepare. The disputes of what exactly happened backstage leading to Mushnick not getting on the air, Byrne claimed when they found out Mushnick wasn't going to be there live and was going to do the interview by phone, that he threatened to leave with McMahon. At that point Thomas suggested what if Mushnick isn't put on the air, and when that was agreed to, Byrne agreed not to leave. Byrne claimed, based on that the producers were the ones who suggested not putting Mushnick on the show. Thomas, on the three-way, seemed rather disgruntled at this claim, and did say they offered not putting Mushnick on the air first, but only after Byrne threatened to leave if he was put on. Byrne claimed that he didn't even know if McMahon was aware of any of this when he went on the air to make his statements about Mushnick. Everyone else involved disputed that McMahon wouldn't have known, to the point Matthews laughed at the assertion. One can also question how it would be possible for Byrne to even make a power play like that, which directly involved McMahon on a live national television show starting in minutes, without at least discussing with him how the play was going to be made. The claim by Byrne that McMahon actually wanted Mushnick on the air and told the two hosts that just before the show started, but said if he was put on, he'd expose the show, or in a later conversation with Thomas on the phone, Byrne claimed McMahon said just before the break to start the segment, "Bring him on, but it'll get ugly," and the host decided not to put Mushnick on was disputed by Thomas because it was the producers, not the hosts, who made that call. Byrne then said that the only ones who would have been there with McMahon when he said it were Kilmeade and Matthews. However, both Kilmeade and Matthews were hotter at that assertion than anything, with Kilmeade's version being that McMahon insisted he wouldn't do the show if Mushnick was allowed on, and Matthews again this week saying the story of him having any interaction right before going on other than saying hello was bullshit then and it's bullshit now. But even if we were to believe there was any kind of a conversation with McMahon wanting him on and the hosts backed down, it would contradict any possibility that McMahon, when making the statement on the air a minute or so after this, made the statement without the knowledge Mushnick wasn't going to be let on. While there are many issues that are being used to confuse this issue, the key point still remains that McMahon knew Mushnick was on hold, wasn't going to be allowed on, and then called him a liar and coward, apparently for not having the guts to be on. At least that's what most viewers watching perceived. Byrne now claims the liar and coward comments were based on things Mushnick had done in the past. Because of a mistake by the producers, McMahon was justified in believing Mushnick would be there live. There is no indication any of the producers told him that day that they had made the mistake in not letting them know ahead of time it was a phone interview, and that Mushnick had never changed his plans and was never supposed to be there live. To the best of my knowledge, it wasn't until March 23rd, during a three-way conversation with Thomas, Byrne and myself, that Byrne first found out that Mushnick was going to do the interview by phone all along. However, 2 days after being told that directly by Thomas, Byrne still insisted that wasn't the case and still insisted Mushnick backed out of being there live and claimed Skritzinski, another producer, would back up his claim. Skritzinski, when contacted, said just the opposite, that Mushnick was never to be there live and never backed out of anything. "We've admitted up front that we f***ed up," said Thomas. "But I can tell you as a fact that Phil Mushnick never backed out." Thomas admitted they probably made a mistake in how they handled things in agreeing not to put Mushnick on. The feeling was that they were trying to save the segment. The other question that needs to be answered is, why would McMahon want Mushnick there live instead of on the phone when the situation as it stood gave McMahon, who understands this better than anyone being that he's an expert when it comes to television, of being the one whose face was on the air, the decided or home field advantage in coming off better? While there is no question McMahon was prepared for Mushnick to be there live, and it does change the dynamics, if anything, it would change the dynamics in a verbal sparring session in his favor. Just as an example, back in 1992, when McMahon was embroiled in a different controversy, he was on the Larry King Show and was confronted by Barry Orton, a former prelim wrestler who told of a story when he was 19, and the late Garvin had spent a lengthy road trip in the West Texas territory, and this was years before either man worked for WWF, trying to convince him to allow him to give him a blow job, and Orton's claim was that by freaking out and turning him down, and with Garvin later in a high-ranking executive position at Titan, that it hurt his career. McMahon was on the Larry King Show, and Orton did a phone interview, and Orton, because of the disadvantage of not being there, came across poorly. A few days later on the Phil Donahue Show, when both were there live, Orton came across a lot stronger than McMahon. Talking to several talk show hosts about this, all agreed that the person there live has a tremendous advantage over the person phoning it in. If the person there live is a television person like McMahon, someone noted that if it was the late Richard Nixon, for example, it would be better phoning it in. And all also believe that the idea that two guys are booked on the same show because it was expected they'd argue, and then the host nixing it because one threatened to make it ugly, doesn't make sense on the surface. One has to wonder why, suddenly thrust into an advantageous position against someone he prepared to bury so badly, that McMahon, or Byrne, would have opted out. Japanese Television Rundown. February 14th, All Japan. 1. Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga beat Misawa and Ogawa and Kakihara in the finals of the Trios tournament in 23:04. The final 12 minutes aired on television. Shiga was apparently nursing a back injury. They mainly beat on him until hot tagging Kobashi. Kobashi dropped Misawa on his head with a half Nelson German suplex. It picked up and turned into an excellent match. Shiga was off a little on a springboard swinging DDT. Excellent finish as Kakihara went for a knee bar on Shiga, who basically blocked it by sitting down and landing on him for the pin. The crowd went crazy with the finish, since it was a surprise and because Shiga got the pin. 3 3/4 stars, most of the rest of the TV show was devoted to Baba's death. February 21st, All Japan. In last week's issue, the show listed as February 21st was actually the February 28th show. This show was devoted mainly to the Jumbo Tsuruta retirement announcement and one match. 1. Vader and Stan Hansen and Monokia Mossman beat Honda and Tao and Izumida in 15:54. Just an awful match. Mossman has a new haircut and bleached his hair. He looks almost exactly like Fit Finlay, which is scary since he's probably 20 years younger. The focus of this match was Vader versus Tao to build to their match 2 weeks later, but they didn't work well together. Tao and Hansen both looked real bad. Hansen moves so slow that it's really bad to watch. Vader pinned Izumida with what is known in the US as the Vader Bomb and in Japan as the Reverse Splash. Tao and Vader had a pull apart after, which was decent. -1/2 star. 313 New Japan. The show opened with an angle from a house show with the lighting so poor it appeared like an ECW fan cam tape. It's amazing to see camcorder production values on a network program. The angle must have been hot because the heat was incredible. Atsushi Onita hit the ring and must have done a hot promo considering he was being pelted with so much garbage. It was mind-boggling since this is Japan and aren't supposed to do that sort of thing. He challenged Muto for the IWGP title, Chono to an explosive match and Choshu as well. Chono got a huge face pop when he came out to confront him. Onita jumped Chono and hit him with the mic and then hit NWO Sting and Akira with the mic. Onita can't wrestle a lick, but he sure knows how to do an angle. 1. Chono and Sting and Akira beat Tenzan and Hiro Saito and Big Titan in 14:45 when Chono made Titan submit to a double arm lock. The last 5 minutes aired. Titan looked terrible, but everyone else looked fine. Akira splashed Titan off the top after the match. The heat was really good. 1.5 star. 2. Sasaki and Koshinaka beat Muto and Kojima in 12:41. The last 6 minutes aired. Fast-paced, really great match. One spot saw in succession Koshinaka do a missile dropkick on Kojima, Muto do a missile dropkick on Koshinaka, and Kojima do a diamond cutter on Koshinaka. The finish saw Sasaki pick Kojima up high in the air and Koshinaka came off the top with a flying hip attack, and then finished him off with 2 power bombs. 3 3/4 stars. 3. Saito and Titan beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto via DQ in 3:21. They are trying to get Goto and Ohara over as this mid-card hardcore type tag team. The problem is this was awful. Titan was missing everything. Goto headbutted the ref. They did a double flapjack on Titan through a table and were beating on Titan with the table. They tied a rope around Saito's neck and began choking him, and the ref got up and called for the DQ. In a country where fans expect clean finishes, this got over poorly and fans booed this heavily. -1/2 star. 4. Muto and Tenzan and Kojima beat Tadao Yasuda and Sasaki and Tatsumi Fujinami in 14:06. The final 6 minutes aired. Fast-paced and a lot of heat, but the work early on wasn't that good. It picked up toward the end with Kojima using a reverse armbar on Yasuda for the submission. Crowd heat made this. 3 1/4 stars. 5. Chono and Akira and Sting beat Koshinaka and Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi in 13:49. The last 6 minutes aired on television, ending with Chono pinning Nakanishi after a Yakuza kick. Nagata was real good and everyone else was okay. Good heat, although the previous match was better. 2 1/2 stars. The show ended with clips of Onita in action from his March 7 Korakuen Hall show. The New Japan TV announcer went there to interview Onita, and Onita slapped him. This wasn't nearly as good as when David Schultz slapped John Stoessel 15 years ago. The guy didn't sell it at all as he got back up and continued the interview. March 20th New Japan. 1. Muto and Kojima beat Nagata and Yamazaki in 11:41. The second half aired on television and it was real good, in particular the work of Kojima and Nagata. Kojima delivered 2 lariats which Nagata stayed up for, and when he went for a third, Nagata did this desperation overhead belly-to-belly suplex. With both stunned, Kojima delivered another lariat for the pin. 3 1/2 stars. 2. Don Fry beat Fujinami in 6:41. This wasn't a good match either for work or pacing because Fry is so green and Fujinami isn't the guy to carry him, but everything they did had great heat. Fry jumped Fujinami before the bell and Brian Johnston hit the ring and attacked him. After that was broken up, Fujinami opened strong with 2 dragon screws and a figure 4. After the open, it got weak. Fry threw a lot of punches and got an armbar, but Fujinami made the ropes. Fujinami did 2 more dragon screws and went for a figure 4, but in doing the move, Fry threw a hard punch and Fujinami was stunned long enough to be caught in an armbar. He stayed in the move for a while before submitting. Finish was very good, and even though Fry had to win because he's getting the Dome title match, the fans seemed surprised with him scoring a clean submission on a legend. He wouldn't break after the match, which saw Johnston do another run-in and a pull apart. After the match, Fry bent over and pulled his pants down. Unlike Billy Gunn, he wasn't wearing any underwear at Johnston and Fujinami. 1 star. 3. Chono and NWO Sting and Akira beat Sasaki and Nakanishi and Koshinaka in 11:14 when Chono pinned Sasaki after a Yakuza kick. Fast-paced but no more than a decent match. 2 stars. 4. Kanemoto beat Liger in 31:38 to win the IWGP Junior title. The last 15 minutes aired on television. It's hard to say if that would have made the match look better or not. Usually with All Japan big matches and the majority of New Japan matches, they are better in their entirety when you see them later on home video than in their edited television version, so this may be one to check out. Based on the television portion, this was match of the year caliber. Liger actually dropped Kanemoto on his head, actually all the way over onto his face, with a released German suplex on the floor. Kanemoto hit 2 straight overhead belly-to-belly suplexes. They had some great submission with dramatic rope break spots, mainly built around Kanemoto getting ankle locks and Liger struggling to the ropes. Liger used his regular arsenal, including a brainbuster off the ropes and the palm blows. They hit each other with palm blows until Kanemoto got the edge, got a near fall with a tiger suplex, but Liger kicked out, and followed with a moonsault senton and a moonsault to finally get the pin. 4 1/2 stars. Mexico. An update of sorts on the situation with Lismark Sr. The only thing we know is that Lismark Sr. didn't suffer a heart attack. The AAA Rey Reyes show was reported in the Japanese media as having drawn a near sellout 22,000 fans at El Toreo in Naucalpan. In reality, The building only holds 18,000, so it probably drew a legit 15,000. El Gigante Silva, Giant Silva, returned to the United States after the March 26 show and would return on April 30th. No reason was given, although the belief seems to be that there's no point in using him when the big shows are at Arena Coliseo, and he's better off as an attraction being saved for when they return to Arena Mexico. The only thing we know about the March 26th Arena Coliseo show is that Silva and El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas beat Scorpio Jr., without the mask, and Bestia Salvaje and Apollo Dantes and Gran Marcus Jr. in the main event. Before the match earlier in the day, they did an angle with Scorpio Jr. and referee Roberto Rangel, who he blamed for him losing his mask last week, where he went to jump Rangel as he was getting out of his car, but Rangel went back in and got a club, but Scorpio Jr. got the club and bashed in Rangel's car windows and windshield while Zumbito also attacked the car. This is apparently the hottest EMLL angle in many years. On Dr. Alfonso Morales, who does a regular sports talk show where they rarely discuss wrestling, radio show, the call-in lines literally broke down because of an overflow of calls all regarding people who saw and bought this angle. There have even been protest marches against Scorpio Jr. and Zumbito at the matches over the weekend. The April 2nd Arena Coliseo show is headlined by Scorpio Jr. and Salvaje defending the CMLL tag titles against Santo and Casas with Rangel as referee, and it is sure sellout. They are also doing a one-night tag team tournament with a main eventer and a semi-final wrestler on each team with Emilio Charles Jr. and Tony Rivera, Fuerza Guerrera, and Ray Bucanero, Mr. Niebla and Atlantico, Apollo Dantes and Karloff Lagarde Jr., Astro Ray Jr. and Shocker, who is teasing a heel turn, Violencia and El Satanico, Starman and Felino and Blue Panther and Ultimo Guerrero. A baseball stadium show on March 20th in Cuernavaca headlined by El Hijo del Diablo and Pirata Morgan beating Santo and Mascara Sagrada drew a sellout 12,000 fans. Antonio Pena announced that Triple Mania 7 will be in Monterrey on June 6th. This was announced also as if it will be Pero Arguello's final match with the AAA promotion. Arguello said that he would wrestle one match after this, a retirement match at Arena Mexico, which he wants to be held in June. Astro Ray Jr. won the Mexican national welterweight title from Archangel on March 22nd in Puebla. Mil Mascaras did an interview this week in the newspapers saying he would be retiring soon to run for public office. Hey, that's what he said. Since we know he'll never take his mask off, Mexico will become the first country where they elect a masked governor. Efren Cadena, who wrestled as El Vlavelito, died on March 19th at the age of 84. He was also the editor of Box y Lucha from 1980 to 1995. Cintia Moreno will be coming to AAA to join her sisters since Esther is out of action with an injury. All Japan. Kenta Kobashi suffered a torn muscle in his foot, I believe, on March 26th, but continued to work on it and wound up with a second injury, which may have been a broken foot, on March 28th. He was taken to the hospital after the show in Nagoya, where he was in pain with every step. We've had conflicting reports on whether or not the foot was actually found to be broken. Because of how important he is and how the tournament is booked out, he's continuing to work, although he was said to have been practically immobile on March 30th in Kanazawa with his offense limited to chopping. And he has a singles match with Mitsuharu Misawa scheduled for March 31st, not to mention singles with the rest of the big stars on the tour. The Carnival Tour opened on March 26th, and the biggest match of the first weekend was March 28th in Nagoya, where Misawa pinned Vader in their first ever singles meeting in 10:52 after a running elbow. This was Vader's first singles loss since joining All Japan. The result is something of a surprise, since the plan going into the tournament was for Misawa to win the Triple Crown from Vader at the Tokyo Dome. They may do a deal where they go to the Carnival Finals and Vader wins the rematch, or it just may be because of the way everything is booked out that Misawa had to win to get to the eventual destination they had planned for the tournament. The Nagoya Aichi Ken Gym was announced as being a sellout 6,050, although the building actually holds close to 10,000. I was told they set up a smaller configuration, but it was actually sold out. In Carnival matches thus far, on March 26th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,100, Misawa beat Jinsei Shinzaki in 16:54 with the running elbow, and Jun Akiyama pinned Akira Tao in 12:48 with the exploder suplex. On March 27th at Korakuen Hall before another sellout 2,100, Kobashi pinned Takao Omori in 17:14 after two lariats in a good match. Gary Albright pinned Yoshihiro Takayama with a German suplex in a bad match, and Vader pinned Johnny Ace in 9:19 with a splash in a good match. Besides Misawa over Vader, the only tournament match on March 28th was Takayama and Omori going to a 30 minutes draw, which was said to have been surprisingly very good. March 29 in Fukui before 1900 saw Tao pin Ace with 2 Nadawas in 11:58 and Misawa pinned Albright after a running elbow in 10:37. March 30 in Kanazawa saw Albright pin Amori, Ace pinned Takayama and Vader pinned Akiyama in their first ever singles match. The Misawa-Vader match will air on television on April 3. Saw the March 15 Jumbo Tsuruta television special. They aired clips of his most famous matches and had a farewell interview. It was really a major touching deal the way they ended the show with Tsuruta at the Narita airport flying to Portland with Misawa at the airport as he left. One thing really obvious from watching the clips that even though his 70s stuff seems to be the most legendary, his best matches were early 90s against Misawa, Kawada, and Kobashi. Bruno Sammartino has confirmed going to the Tokyo Dome on May 2 as a special guest to honor Baba. The only other name we know of from the US who will appear in that capacity is the Destroyer. Apparently Dory Funk wanted to go, but due to politics being what they are and leftover heat from when he stopped working for All Japan, it doesn't look like it will happen. March 21 TV drew a 4.7 rating. New Japan. With no cards this week other than a show at a hotel ballroom, most everything is built around hyping the April 10 Tokyo Dome show. They've been keeping quiet about the advance, which tells you all you need to know. The only word we have is that it is well behind what would be expected based on past Dome shows, although the January show had a week advance and still wound up being full. That was based on the January 4th tradition as we figured that would sell out. But Tokyo Dome shows on other dates have been harder sells in the past unless they have the killer main event and Keiji Muto vs. Don Frye, isn't it? Most of the TV has been strongly built around Masahiro Chono vs. Atsushi Onita. Onita has gotten a lot of press because he passed a test that would allow him to enter a night school class to get his high school diploma. He dropped out of school at the age of 16 to join All Japan Pro Wrestling, which starts on April 12. There was a lot of teasing the referee would be Riki Choshu, but it was announced on March 30 the referee would be Hiroyuki Uno, who is the main ref for the War promotion, thus would be a neutral ref because Onita was mad because the New Japan ref DQ'd him at the last Dome show. There still may be a second ref added. Chono left Japan probably to get more treatment on his bad neck, but it is said he's buying a new outfit for a Dynamite bout. He left on March 28 and at the airport told reporters as an angle that he wouldn't do the match unless New Japan takes out a 100 million yen, about $825,000 these days, insurance policy on him for the match, and that if he so much as burns one finger he wants to be able to collect the insurance. Sounds like an angle he learned from talking to those Minnesota guys about their Lloyd's policies. March 20th TV show did a 3.3 rating. Other Japan notes. Lineup announced for the Rings show on April 23 at Osaka Furitsu Gym is Frank Shamrock vs. Kiyoshi Tamura, Tsuyoshi Kosaka vs. Gilbert Yvel, Yope Castale vs. Yoshihisa Yamamoto, Masayuki Naruse vs. Chris Hazuman and Ryuki Kamiyama vs. Lee Hasdell. There is apparently a lot of controversy regarding the March 22 Randy Couture loss to Ilyakine Mikhail. The match aired on television this weekend so I haven't seen it, but the photos show Mikhail going for a shoulder lock as they rolled to the ropes. They maneuvered the guys back to the center keeping the position. That looks so goofy when it's done and again points out the superiority of an octagon as a fighting arena as compared to a pro wrestling ring, and Mikhail apparently made the move immediately and got the hold and the ref stopped it before Couture tapped. We'll have more to say about it when we see the tape. Weekly Gong had a story on Mark Coleman due to the Takada match on April 29 and in it there were several references to his possibly going to the WWF. Hikari Fukuoka, 28, the longtime JWP champion, had her retirement show on March 28 at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,000 fans, ending her 8-year career. In her final match, they brought back Hiromi Yagi, who has been wrestling of late with JD, and Kandi Akutsu, who quit JWP for Urgent, to reform their High-Chan trio from several years back, going to a 30-minute draw with Commando Bolshoi and Carlos Amano and Azumi Hyuga, Tomoko Kuzumi, who recently beat her for the JWP title. They held a retirement ceremony after the match with Dynamite Kansai asking her to deliver one final clothesline, which she did. She is retiring because she will be getting married and working full-time at her future husband's restaurant in Akita. Saw the Yumiko Hata WWWA title win over Shinobu Kondori from March 10, which drew the big TV rating, 5.7 for a women's show airing after midnight. They must have papered the crowd or something because the crowd behaved like those on-cue extras you used to get at a WCW Universal Studios taping. They were popping huge for everything. On TV it came off as the best crowd reactions to a women's show in years. It was a stiff, really good match ending with Hata kicking Kandori in the face as she was on the apron. The finish was weak for a title change because Kandori was 3/4 of the way back in the ring when the ref counted 10 and gave Hata the belt via count out. Fans went nuts for the change and it was one of the biggest pops for any finish in Japan in a long time. Antonio Inoki announced that Naoya Ogawa's first NWA title defense would take place on April 24 in Iowa, which, if that's the case, will probably ruffle some feathers in the US. IWA Japan will be holding a 5th-year anniversary tour from April 9 to April 13 with Terry Funk, Doug Gilbert, Mr. Pogo, Ghostface, Tarzan Goto under a mask, and Shoji Nakamaki as the top stars. In Toto on April 11, Funk and Keisuke Yamada face Pogo and Nakamaki in a no-rope barbed wire match. April 13 at Korakuen Hall in a bunkhouse death match has Funk and Yamada and Yoshia Yamashita versus Nakamaki and Pogo and Grand Sheik, veteran Mexican wrestler Arias Romero, Gilbert versus Ghostface for the IWA World title, and AJW's Takako Inoue versus Sachi Nishibori. Aki-Isa Mera, Great Kabuki, will referee on this tour. Great Sasuke pinned Judo Suwa on March 28 in Sendai before 673 fans to retain the NWA middleweight title. Battler says running April 26 at Korakuen Hall with Minoru Fujita versus Ikuto Hidaka, Sasuke versus Minoru Tanaka, who won the recent JJC singles tournament to get the shot for the NWA middleweight title, Yuki Ishikawa and Carl Greco versus Bob Backlund and Daisuke Ikeda, and Alexander Otsuka versus Daisuke Ikeda on top. On May 14 they are running at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center, which will be torn down shortly after that, with Ishikawa versus Mitsuhiro Matsunaga in a bed of nails death match. FMW is looking at doing Hiromichi Koto Fuyuki versus Tarzan Goto for their world title as the main event on the May 5 Yokohama Bunka Gym show, but on March 24, Goto said that when he quit FMW in 1995 he decided he would never go back. FMW ran Korakuen Hall drawing an almost packed building of 1,500 on March 29 with Hayabusa and Fuyuki going to a 30-minute draw with Masato Tanaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda in the main event as part of their ongoing tag team tournament. Here and there. We just received word on the death of Kurt Von Hess, who wrestled from 1969 to 1986 mainly in Canada and in the old Buffalo-Cleveland circuit. This Kurt Von Hess, real name William Earl Terry, shouldn't be confused with the original Kurt Von Hess from the 50s, Frank Faculty, who is thought to be still alive. Terry passed away on March 13 at his home in Hamilton, Ontario after a heart attack at the age of 56. After training in Hamilton, he debuted in Toronto in 1969 going to a draw with Ivan Koloff and wrestled mainly in the NWF promotion, Pedro Martinez company that ran Buffalo and Cleveland in the early 70s. He was mainly a heel tag team wrestler, as most doing German gimmicks were in those days, with such partners as Eric the Red, John Quinn, Siegfried Stanka, Crazy Luke Graham, Otto von Heller, Randy Cully, and Karl von Schatz. Von Hess and von Schatz were a regular tag team for New Japan Pro Wrestling from 1974 to 1977 and also wrestled frequently in both South Africa and the Caribbean. After that run, he stayed in the Canada, mainly working indie tours in Northern Ontario in the late 70s through the mid-80s for the legendary character Dave Behrman McKigney, which such names as Angelo Mosca, the Sheik, Chris Tolos, Sweet Daddy Siki, Cowboy Frankie Lane, and a young wrestler named Terry S.R. Sabu. He retired in 1986 due to kidney problems. He had been on kidney dialysis since 1992 and had dropped to about 180 pounds. He was 270 as a wrestler. 3 years ago, when he was literally on the verge of death, he had a kidney transplant from a 31-year-old man who died in an auto accident. Last year he appeared as part of the Ilio Di Paolo show for WCW in Buffalo. Probably the most famous match of his career would have been August 16, 1974 in Los Angeles at the Olympic Auditorium when he and Von Schatz came in billed as NWA North American Tag Team Champions and lost the titles to Antonio Inoki and Seiji Sakaguchi, which became through 1981 the main tag team title for New Japan Pro Wrestling. A couple of books on wrestling came across the desk this week. Lou Albano and Burt Randolph Sugar's The Complete Idiot's Guide to Pro Wrestling is published by Macmillan USA. I will say this, the book is better than I thought it would be, which I guess tells you my expectations going in. It's more like a pro wrestling magazine, and by that I mean one a level lower on the IQ scale than even the Raw magazine or even Pro Wrestling Illustrated, close to the Napolitano magazine level, except that it's 340 pages. No tough subject is tackled. Virtually no insight is given. But for a fan who doesn't care about wrestling as anything more than a momentary diversion, but wants to know more about it and its history, this is an easy read. I got through the 340 pages in 1 hour. A lot of the history is inaccurate fluff, and virtually all the meaty part of the history was taken from Luth's book Hooker, which is credited. It has profiles on many of the legendary figures in wrestling, usually limited to 2 or 3 paragraphs and running away from any controversy. They do admit to wrestling being staged theatrics today, although the claim is that in the past 40 to 50% of the matches were real, and in writing about matches in the 50s through the mid-80s, it is written as if they were real. Albano, when discussing his career, talks about all his angles as being real. Actually, controversies surrounding wrestling in its early history, such as exposes in the first half of the century, are talked about, although not in detail. But for the current product, anything controversial is avoided. As an example, the word steroids is only in the book twice, in the short profile on Billy Graham, and then talked about it as if he used steroids as a teenager while competing in bodybuilding, which was actually many years before he did, and that his physical problems later in life were as a result of his abuse at that time, actually giving the impression he never used steroids during his career as a pro wrestler. Sugar actually called me a few months ago because there was apparently a dispute between himself and Albano, him feeling for the credibility of the book that steroids would have to be quickly mentioned because the Zarian and McMahon trials couldn't be ignored. He wasn't thinking for a second of actually getting into the subject, while Albano was against it, but they had agreed to a compromise where it would be said that some wrestlers used steroids years ago when they were legal, and obviously, even they didn't end up making it in. In Bret Hart's 3-paragraph bio, the only reference to what without question will go down as the most important match of this decade was a contract dispute brought an end to his WWF affiliation in 1997 with no reference at all to the movie or the match. For Michaels, it was said his most famous matches were with Razor Ramon and Undertaker. So when it comes to modern history, this isn't tap dancing around serious stories. This is running like hell from them in the other direction even more than a wrestling magazine. International wrestling doesn't exist, and laughably, in its listing of active wrestling federations, while they do have EMLL listed, no Japanese group is listed except for the JWA, Japan Wrestling Association, which hasn't existed since 1973. The heights and weights are the same bogus PWI stuff taken right out of their files, where the weights never changed no matter how silly they look in print these days. Andre is 7'5", Abdullah the Butcher is still 360 pounds, Scott Steiner still weighs 235, Kevin Nash weighs 356, Hogan is still 6'8", Jay Strongbow is 6'6", 320 while Yokozuna is only 340. Albano claimed to have never bladed in his career, and never bled except in a cage match. Abraham Lincoln was a champion wrestler. Still, for a vague point of view for a novice that has never read anything about wrestling, they would learn something about basics of wrestling and a version of history that is a little bit of truth sprinkled with a heavy dose of fiction. If you've read Hooker and the PWI Almanac, you'll know almost everything in here and a whole lot more. If you read The Observer, I'd only recommend it to you if you're someone who collects anything and everything about pro wrestling. The funniest thing of all was in the promotional material for the book where Albano claimed to have discovered both Hulk Hogan and Jesse Ventura. The other end of the spectrum is an online update to Jason Campbell's original wrestling supercards and tournaments. There is no writing at all, this is simply a list and results, along with, in most cases, attendance and in some cases gates, pay-per-view buy rates or television ratings of the show, of virtually every major pro wrestling show around the world, certainly the last 25 years, with sketchy updates on almost every big show, at least in the US historically, plus major tournaments. It's for the serious fan who wants to look back at historical big shows and find out what happened, or at least what the final result was, as opposed to a vague memory of such, but with no details, as the aforementioned most famous match in recent years in this book was simply Shawn Michaels forced Bret Hart to submit, 12-11, to win the WWF World title. It also has all UFC, EFC, Pride, etc. show results. This is an invaluable reference material for people who would be interested in such. The accuracy is as good as can be expected. There is no way to document what happened in the 30s because you are relying on newspaper clippings, and like today, newspaper coverage of wrestling wasn't always accurate. And in those days, many times the newspaper would be on the take from the local wrestling promoter. Some of the attendance figures listed on shows, particularly big shows in Japan, are in many cases what is listed in the Japanese media, which are often exaggerated, although our coverage isn't immune from that from time to time, although we probably do a better job than any major media source at least on getting realistic estimates for the big shows. The comprehensiveness of the Japanese stuff from the 70s to the present, particularly when it comes to the tournaments and listing every major show I can think of from the minor companies, including many that often fall into the blanks of history and memory, shows an amazing amount of research. Besides, I had totally forgotten that martial arts legend Benny the Jet Urquidez was on the very first New Japan Tokyo Dome show. In Puerto Rico, the biggest program right now is between Pierroth and Ray Gonzalez over both Pierroth's IC title and Gonzalez's Universal title. On March 20th in Guaynabo for only the Universal title, they did a Dusty-like finish where after a ref bump, Pierroth put a foreign object in his mask and did a headbutt, and a second ref counted the pin, but the first ref after the fact ruled Gonzalez as being DQ'd for dropkicking the ref, thus saving the title. Pierroth challenged him to a rematch, but Gonzalez agreed only if Pierroth also put up his belt. The match on March 27th in the same building billed as a winner-take-all match saw Gonzalez use a figure 4 holding onto the ropes a la Flair to get the 3 count. The local commissioner then ordered the match restarted because Gonzalez used the ropes. Pierroth then got the pin using the ropes, but the commissioner again overruled the finish and ordered it restarted. Both wrestlers then attacked the ref and it was ruled a double DQ. This set up a third meeting on April 3rd, which will actually be 3 different matches. The first match will be for the IC title. The second match will be for the Universal title. The third match will be hair versus mask. Pierroth, who lost his mask last year in Mexico to La Parca in the famous match in Nuevo Laredo, is working here with the mask, and it was acknowledged once on television that he had lost the mask in Mexico. Anyway, there'll also be no DQ, and the commission stated that if any wrestler attempts to interfere in the match, they will be suspended for life. Dutch Mantle and Jungle Jim Steele, Wolf Hockfield in All Japan, both return on that show. Steele faces Glamour Boy Shane for the vacant WWC TV title. The last champ was Sean Morley, currently Val Venus, who hasn't been around in a long time. Fidel Sierra has also returned doing a program with Carlos Colon for Colon's Puerto Rican title, and Chicky Star and Victor the Bodyguard defend the tag titles against Invaders, Iron 3. Leigh Thatcher is putting together the second annual Brian Pillman Memorial Show for May 19th at the Cincinnati Gardens. The talent list isn't complete, but WCW has agreed to send talent, and also appearing signing autographs will be Ricky Steamboat and Woman. Sid Vicious debuted for Kick-Ass Wrestling on March 27th in Memphis. Sid power bombed 4 job guys and spray-painted palm on their backs. Tommy Rogers and Tracy Smothers are supposed to be in for this coming weekend's TV tapings. On the Power Pro show there was an argument at the start of the show as Randy Hales wanted to announce and Dave Brown walked off the set. Brown ended up coming back as Derek King, in the role of acting president with Brandon Baxter out of action, ruling that security would remove Hales from the set and that Brown would be brought back. Announced for the April 2nd show at New Daisy Theater is the Fabs vs. Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee, Michael Hayes and Baxter and mystery partner and announcer Corey Macklin vs. Downtown Bruno and Hales and Baldo and Glenn Kolka, however that ended up being changed since Baldo turned face by the end of the show. Kurt Angle vs. Mike Tierney, Brian Christopher vs. Streak, Aaron O'Grady and Vic Grimes defend the tag titles against Kid Wicket and Derek King in prelims. Lawler, when doing an interview, said that Stacy had gotten a big head and told her not to get like Sable. They heavily teased that Jackie Fargo, who was the biggest Memphis draw in the 60s, would be coming in for the show. Stacy said if Fargo showed up that she'd slap his face. However, Dundee ran down Lane, Kieran and Fargo in his interview, saying that Fargo had gambled all his money away and that's why he created the Fabs, and said Fargo himself knew that Lane and Kieran couldn't beat Lawler and Dundee. Baldo's turn came when Kolka and Grimes jumped Brandon Baxter and Baldo made the save and laid both out. They are doing an angle where Kurt Angle wins all his matches in 30 seconds or less that seemed reminiscent of how Dusty Rhodes first got Magnum TA over a decade ago, or for that matter, how Goldberg got over the Tennessee Vols. Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins regained the NWA North American Tag Team titles from Brian Christopher and Spellbinder Streak on March 25th in Nashville before 175 fans. Christopher came out refusing to wrestle with a Music City ref and brought out honest referee Clyde Lou Fabiano, better known as Muhammad Hossein, during a long run as a heel years back in WWC. Fabiano called it straight until the finish, but when Dunn had Spellbinder pinned, he gave Christopher a chain and Christopher pinned Dunn to win the match. However, local ref Kurt Turner came out and restarted the match and they did a double small package spot for the title change. Dunn also took the NWA Southwest version of the Texas title, beating Brian Adias on March 26th in North Richland Hills, Texas. There will apparently be a major wrestling tour of Australia starting on July 17th run by Peter Skapetis, with Roland Alexander of the Northern California All-Pro Wrestling office booking talent with the Bushwhackers on the first tour. Christopher Daniels and Lance Diamond are being brought in for shows in late May for APW and Michael Modest. Tony Jones, Max Justice and Boyce LeGrand are being sent to work for promoter Blaine DeSantis in Pennsylvania in mid-May. NWA New England has withdrawn all references to not recognizing Naoya Ogawa as NWA champion and stopped all plans to crown a new champion. However, the group has been critical of the Howard Brody/UFO arrangement which led to Ogawa getting the belt, saying that all NWA board members were not informed of the deal and it wasn't brought to a formal vote. They also claim 2 of the voting parties received direct financial compensation from the deal which they claim as a conflict of interest. Tony Rumble and Sheldon Goldberg, who serves as on-camera commissioner and part of the booking team for NWA New England, have claimed the UFO deal wasn't brought to a board vote until after the deal had been announced publicly. Goldberg says that while the Ogawa title switch was a news story in Japan, NWA New England felt there was more to the big picture than getting the NWA name over in Japan again. They claim the NWA is an association of small regional promoters as opposed to President Howard Brody's perception of it as a national product. They note that the NWA doesn't produce any marketing material and NWA New England wasn't even sent a photo of Ogawa to use on its website, and now they have no practical access to the world champion of the organization they pay dues to because he lives in Japan and the costs of flying him in to work an indie show are prohibitive, if he even agreed to do it in the first place at an affordable price. The IWA is apparently holding a deathmatch tournament on June 18th and June 19th with the location being kept secret to stay away from commission supervision. Tiger Mask, Michinoku Pro, Christopher Daniels, California, Grand Naniwa, Michinoku, and MPW ref Ted Tanabe will appear on the first UWA TV taping on April 11th in London, England, along with many British wrestlers. In a totally fictitious story to build up the show, the newspaper Daily Sport in England ran a story on local wrestler Alex Shane, who claims to have bedded 700 women and claimed to know 70 submission holds in bed. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal on March 28, Senator Bill Bradley is attempting to portray himself as a common man in his attempt for the Democratic nomination for president and said he was copying this from the successful marketing strategy of Jesse Ventura. USWF on April 24th in Lubbock, Texas is headlined by Evan Tanner defending his title just 6 days after doing the Pancrase pay-per-view show against Vincent Nixon plus both middleweight and heavyweight tournaments. Roller Jam finished its first season with tapings over the weekend at Universal Studios in Orlando. The tapings are about 6 weeks ahead of air date. There were tons of changes and none of them sound good. Starting very soon, and it could be as soon as this coming week, the Friday night airing on TNN will move back 1 hour to 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern. At some point in April, a second change will be made with one game airing 9 to 10 p.m. on Monday nights, which means it'll go against both Raw and Nitro, let alone football in the fall. The idea they are trying to sell is that they'll get viewers that are switching back and forth from Nitro and Raw, which is the lamest explanation for something that is sure to fail that I've ever heard. The second game will air Friday from 9 to 10 p.m. while both games repeated as a doubleheader in the current Saturday 5 to 7 p.m. slot. With producer Brian Godinsky dropped after the last tapings, all angles and storylines that had been started and were planned for this taping were dropped. At the last taping a few weeks ago, they did an angle where Richard Brown and Mark D'Amato, the top male heels on different teams, would settle their differences and work together with a slogan "Bad, Brown and D'Amato is good," and they got the audience to chant it. Fans were still chanting it at this taping even though it had been dropped, and there were a lot of "bad is good" signs in the crowd. So after a season of weird, usually lame storylines, the season ended with a simple game of roller derby without storylines. The crowd seemed to like it, but there wasn't any heat or emotion to the crowd. Trackside announcer Tom Chae-Suk, who trained to skate but was never good enough, got his chance over the weekend, and it was said to have been like watching the worst celebrity do a pro wrestling match times 10, as he couldn't skate but the other skaters still had to put him over. The season finished with the Founders Cup tournament. In the old roller derby in the 60s and 70s, they used to have that as a mid-season classic, usually to establish a heel team that would win as the favorite for the end of the season World Championships, where that heel team would lose to the Bay Bombers at the end. The finish saw the Quakes beat the Enforcers on the last jam when Tim Washington picked up the bench and went to hit Sean Atkinson, but instead hit D'Amato, and Atkinson scored the winning points. Atkinson, as a shoot, was crying at the awards banquet because his grandfather and grandmother were derby pioneers and both his parents were stars as well. It looked real cheesy because the Founders Cup turned out to be 18 inches high and weigh about 2 ounces. The third place game with the Hot Dice versus Sundogs ended in a tie, so they had Micah Martin Dice versus Sam Martin in a match race. When the audience heard the game would be settled in this way, they popped big. The race itself was bad because they had never done one before. On the last lap, Micah leapfrogged over Sam and crossed the finish line. The only problem was that Sam was booked to win. Sam tried to dive over the finish line and win, but Micah still crossed first, and even though the Sundogs were the home team and won, the crowd was chanting "fixed" after it was over. These games were said to be the best thus far this season. There was talk at the tapings of doing games in Texas, Las Vegas, and Atlantic City, but I don't see it. The skaters were told that everything is being shut down until April 19th, and no salaries are going to be paid until that point. From April 19th until May 30th, they will start training classes, and if the skaters log 15 hours of practice per week, they will be paid half their salary, and they will also be working on TV grooming at the sessions. All the contracts are officially up, and the skaters were told that if they attend the sessions, that doesn't guarantee a spot next season. One would think that under those circumstances that a lot of the skaters will end up disappearing, as generally most were making $700 to $750 per week, and cut in half is no longer that great of a job. It appears Ken Resnick is done as well. A local group which advertised heavily on the TNN shows in this area played on March 27th at the San Francisco Bill Graham Civic, figuring the TV and the media spotlight done by Roller Jam would help spark interest in the local league, which has been around forever, but apparently they had to heavily paper the house. Stampede Wrestling is now running weekend shows in Alberta and smaller cities, drawing between 100 and 250 fans. The first TV taping is April 2nd in Calgary. They weren't able to get a wrestling license in Edmonton, so they are running in Habema, an Indian reservation 20 miles outside Edmonton, on April 3rd. Former Carolina star Sweet Hansen was hospitalized a few weeks back due to an irregular heartbeat. Former NWA champ Ron Garvin, now 55, and Tim Horner captured the tag team titles from Tennessee Mountain Wrestling from Dirty White Boy and Jeff Anderson on March 27th in Knoxville. In what should be one of his final matches, Terry Funk will be appearing on a show at the Willie Carnes Rec Center in Atala, Alabama on April 17th, on a show that will also include Hector Guerrero and Rip Rogers. MMA. According to Art Davie, the former UFC matchmaker who now heads the U.S. division of K1, the first K1 event in the United States was not a money loser and in fact made a small profit. Davie said the live house in Las Vegas was strong, and that while the pay-per-view didn't do very well, they had a lot of strong corporate sponsors of the event to make up the difference. He said they were looking at August 21st at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas for the next U.S. show, although did note K1 had a major date already booked in Japan on August 22nd. He said the plans for the show at this point are to main event with Rick Rufus versus Curtis Schuster, who has had 2 knee operations since the August 7th K1 where Jean-Claude Luyard took out his knee, but on one leg. Schuster came back to knock him out in one of the gutsiest fighting performances of this or any other year, and have an 8-man tournament underneath. He said as it regarded talk in Japan of K1 going into Madison Square Garden this year, that his belief is the show belong in Las Vegas, and said there had been contact with the Garden, but it was limited to one phone call. The March 22nd K1 show, which aired on a Monday night after midnight on NTV, drew a 7.4 rating, which is considered phenomenal. Boss Rutan appeared on the CBS TV show Martial Law on March 27th in a role that was apparently just as prominent as Steve Austin's on Nash Bridges. Obviously Rutan wasn't a ratings draw like Austin, but he was said to have done a good job playing the role of a bad guy who was a former Dutch no-holds-barred fighting champion. That's a stretch. People who saw it said he showed a lot of personality, which isn't surprising. The Fox Files TV show on March 25th ran a feature on MMA fighting filmed at a John LeBay show. Apparently the feature, which I didn't see, got a lot of people upset with its inaccuracies, such as talking about it being bare-knuckle combat, while showing all the fighters involved wearing gloves, and bringing up the death of Douglas Edge. ECW. It was a pretty quiet week with shows on March 25th in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania drawing 1,700, a TV taping on March 26th in Binghamton, New York doing 2,500, and a house show on March 27th in Freeport, New York drawing 1,200. The biggest negative or positive, depending upon how you look at it, is that in all 3 cities, the crowd was constantly chanting for Sid in every match. It's as if the people are now coming out to see the Sid run in, and he wasn't booked on any of the shows, although there was some advertising out for him to appear in Freeport. Every time a wrestler got on the mic to issue a challenge, the place would go nuts chanting for Sid to come out and shut him up. Sabu didn't wrestle all weekend either. He missed Wilkes-Barre, as apparently there was one of those regular disputes with he and Paul Heyman after the pay-per-view. We didn't get any real details other than in Wilkes-Barre, Heyman was saying that Sabu quits all the time and always comes back, and he was back the next night. However, the New York State Athletic Commission wouldn't allow him to wrestle the next 2 nights due to his jaw being broken in 3 places, but he did do run-ins at the shows. On April 3rd at the ECW Arena, it looks to be a cage match with New Jack and Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney versus Mr. Mustafa and Dudley's, and a single match with Super Crazy versus Mosco de la Merced. Jose Francisco, 21 years old, who made his pro wrestling debut at the age of 14, who debuts this coming week, and is expected to wear his mask, although he lost the mask late last year in Mexico. The morale has improved to a degree with all the checks clearing, although people are still worried about the long-term future. The tapings were uneventful, with the biggest deal being a Tracy Smothers vs. Jerry Lynn match interrupted by Rob Van Dam, who attacked Smothers while Sabu beat up Tommy Rich, who is on the way out, and Van Dam challenged Lynn. Van Dam won, but I doubt they'd show that match on television since it doesn't make much sense to show Van Dam beating Lynn on TV before the pay-per-view. In the same cage match they are doing on April 3rd, which they did on March 26th in Binghamton at the TV taping, it ended with New Jack doing a dive off the cage onto Mustafa through a table. TV this week was mainly pay-per-view highlights and 2 matches from the last ECW Arena show. They aired Yoshihiro Tajiri over Little Guido with a low dropkick and pin in an entertaining match. This was mainly to set up the breakup where Tracy Smothers attacked Guido. The other was Super Crazy over Antifaz del Norte in an even better match as these two work with each other great and the crowd was hot and appreciative of it. Crazy has a lot of charisma to go along with his obvious ability and he's clearly broken out of the pack in at least ECW fans' mindset of the acrobatic Mexicans who can work but aren't meant to be taken seriously. WCW. Scott and Dana Hall were remarried over the weekend. I guess the deal they came to is that Scott would take a leave of absence from WCW but that he would eventually return, but when he does so, he'll get a lighter schedule a la Sting when he was working out his marital situation. Those close to Hall say he's been miserable much of the past year due to not seeing his kids, which brought on all his documented problems. There's a ton behind the scenes regarding the Bret Hart quitting angle on Nitro on March 28th in Toronto. The angle went pretty much as planned, but there was a lot of backstage maneuvering trying to kill and or change the angle. Basically several weeks back, Hart came to Bischoff with this angle which would heat him up for working on top on pay-per-view shows. Despite what you probably have read elsewhere and will read elsewhere and will be rumored everywhere, Hart is going nowhere and is under contract for longer than will be publicized in works storylines that will come out. With the quitting angle, the idea his contract is up soon and thus teasing he's leaving, and you know where that speculation goes, will be made as part of the angle. Legitimately it appears, as I'll get to in a second, Kevin Nash was mad about the angle, or at least he was telling everyone who would listen that. Nash had already gone to Hart last week and wanted to use all the heat on the internet about him burying Hart, which he was doing, and turn it into an angle where he could become a heel booker since that's what he's being portrayed at anyway, and Hart fans were all over his website blaming him for Hart's lack of a push. Nevertheless, even though Nash told Hart he wanted to turn this into an angle, there must have been some heat at some level since Nash didn't want the Hart-Goldberg angle to take place and was complaining that he was given control to be booker and this angle was sprung on him and he didn't want it, and he was told by Bischoff they wouldn't interfere with him as they had with previous bookers before the Panama Beach Nitro, and he basically let Dusty Rhodes put the show together, something the whole company was paying for the next week. A lot of the other power brokers got in Bischoff and others' ear about the angle potentially ruining Goldberg, particularly being done in Toronto where Hart would get the face reaction. Bischoff wanted Hart to run down Canada and the Canadian government in his interview before Goldberg came out so Goldberg would be the face in the angle, but Hart refused. Nash also wanted the angle to end with Hart quitting, but Nash jumping him and leaving him laying on the way out as the bully booker to start a program between the two of them, which Hart also refused since he thought he and Bischoff had already agreed upon the direction of the angle, and he clearly had it in his mind that this was the night he rehabbed his past year plus of floundering. Because so many people feared damage to Goldberg, Bischoff ordered the Goldberg chants piped into the building. The fans were actually booing him heavily when Goldberg came out to be turned up full blast. The angle, which saw Hart get a phenomenal response similar to what Rock has been getting in WWF the past few weeks, probably second only to Flair that night in Greenville, challenged Goldberg, Hogan, Flair and others. Goldberg came out and speared Hart, but when both guys were on the mat dead, they were both down for way too long before Hart recovered and covered Goldberg and counted 1, 2, 3. Hart then took off his hockey jersey revealing a metal plate around his stomach that KO'd Goldberg, which actually got a big pop as well. It probably would have been slightly more effective had it been done with a ref counting the pin in a real match, but I guess nobody wanted Hart to actually beat Goldberg. The biggest pop, and this surprised me, was during the interview when Hart talked about Goldberg putting up money to challenge Steve Austin, and how he's the guy who beat Austin every time they wrestled. I figured even in Canada that would elicit at least some boos, but instead it drew the biggest cheers. There were a lot of people hot backstage at Hart for bringing Austin's name up, But it did make sense for him to do it because it positioned him as one of the biggest stars in the business at a time when he hasn't been viewed as that in a while, and besides, it got the biggest pop of anything on the show. He then said WCW didn't respect him and said he was quitting the company and walked out of the building. Bischoff and Hart tried to work the people and the wrestlers backstage that the angle was a shoot as they argued backstage with no cameras on in front of the wrestlers, but Bischoff has done that so often that now the wrestlers consider it a pathetic joke and nobody bought it. However, it drew a lot of mainstream media coverage in Canada that the angle was a shoot with stories of Hart quitting WCW. I'd call this the David Von Erich media theory. I lived in Texas in 1984 when David Von Erich died, and it was barely covered in the local media for 2 days, until the media realized the reaction of the public was so ungodly huge, particularly the teenagers in the market, that it became a front-page story about 3 days after it happened, and then whenever it happened again in the future, with named wrestlers dying in Dallas, which turned out to be far too often. Every other one was played up huge from the start. In this case, when Hart and WWF had the deal in Montreal, it didn't get that much media coverage, although it got some, but in hindsight everyone realized how underplayed the story was in that market, and when they believed it happened again, it was a bigger deal. The plan that WCW wanted was for him to do the Goldberg angle but not to quit on television, and have him call a press conference with no WCW involvement in calling it and say he's quitting so it would get mainstream press and be perceived as legit instead of an angle. However, Hart didn't want to do that because of the long-term ramifications of people feeling used when he comes back, and also the idea that would make people think his leaving the WWF was an angle as well. He's trying to play this off publicly as something of the effect of he's not retiring but he's sitting out and is not sure what his next move will be, but that he can't see himself in either WWF or WCW. Actually, there is some truth in that because nobody does know what the next move will be, other than they have to rehab Goldberg next week, which can easily be done with him killing a star. Meng isn't a star. Hart came out of it looking for the first time since coming to WCW as one of the biggest superstars in the business, but it isn't as if WCW has fallen into situations like that before and not done anything with it. Kevin Sullivan, 49, passed out before the show and was literally asleep on the floor backstage and lost control of his bodily functions. The EMTs arrived at the building and Sullivan actually stopped breathing backstage on more than one occasion before he was revived. At one point in the early evening there was fear he had a seizure or even a heart attack, but it turned out not to be as serious as that. With less than 2 weeks before the pay-per-view, nobody has any idea where it's going. The TV would lead one to believe Hogan is going to beat Flair for the title. At one point during the week Flair had been approached about dropping the title in Toronto, and that could also happen in Las Vegas on Nitro. Dusty Rhodes' name was never mentioned, so the angle for him doing a comeback may have been dropped, but who knows with WCW. Nitro March 28 in Toronto drew a sellout 16,195, paying $441,769. The crowd made the show seem good. David Flair and Tori Wilson did a video where David said he considered Hulk Hogan like his father and called Ric Flair a loser. They were chanting "We want Brett" like crazy early on. Conan beat Vince in 5:35 with the Tequila Sunrise. It was funny to watch Vince step all over Conan's interview. Stevie Ray came out for the finish, distracting Vince. Hogan and Tori did a skit with more bad acting where Hogan was bragging about beating Nash for the title in a hard match and that if he had to he could do it again. Hogan came out as a face for an interview and the place went nuts for him. Nobody can believe how easily the Hogan turn is working, in some cities, but not all, as the crowd was dead for him on Thunder. My theory is that the current audience are fans who have been around less than 2 years and they don't even know about why Hogan had to turn and how his career was just about over before the turn because he was being booed out of buildings as a face. They only know Hogan was a face and now he's a cool heel, and they're supposed to cheer for him, and for this audience cheering Hogan is something new and not something tired out of the 80s, for the same reason why Flair's heel routine, which we've all seen before, is getting over even better now than it did when he was actually in his 30s. DDP did a taped interview setting the stage for a heel turn, if the word heel can even be used nowadays. Wrath pinned Kenny Chaos with a meltdown in 8:48. Way too long. On that account, just reread what I've been writing every week since the ratings started falling about long matches. Tori, who still doesn't have a name, was talking with Kevin Nash asking him if it was real when Hogan beat him and saying Hogan told her it was real. Nash got mad. I actually liked how this was being played, but then I remembered that Hogan and Nash were supposedly feuding the entire year of 1998 and never wrestled each other because neither would ever agree to put the other one over, so what good is this? Flair did an interview and called out DDP. The fans booed DDP even before he gave them a reason to. I think he called Scott Scum Steiner, and they're so sick of everyone being scum, I guess. He turned on the crowd big time. Hogan came out. Flair said since Page wanted Scott, who wasn't there, maybe Canada doesn't allow our convicts in their country so easily, and Hogan wanted him, that they should wrestle each other. DDP was still trying to play cool face. Flair told Page he'd be in his corner, but Page didn't like the idea. Rick Steiner pinned Scott Norton with a top rope bulldog in 7:08. This match killed the crowd. Norton has a real ego problem. He kicked out of the pin even though it was the finish. He made Mysterio Jr. look terrible because he had to put him over, and in this match made Steiner look so Joe because he had his hand raised when everyone saw Norton kick out. And can you remember how he wouldn't go down a few months back when all the horsemen jumped him? They should send this guy to Japan where they like him, thinking he's Superman, and throw away the ticket home. Booker T beat Chris Adams in 7:23 with a missile dropkick. It looked like they were potatoing each other left and right. Adams is a good worker, not that he can be pushed now because he can't, but for credibility's sake, he needs to drop 15 pounds because guys who are in their mid-40s, with mush bellies and no tans, aren't accepted by the public even if they can work. Chris Jericho beat Jerry Flynn in 4:34, pinning him using the ropes. Jericho started out doing a total face promo, but then said he was so happy he left Canada because he hated it. The fans were really wanting to cheer him. This match was a mess as they were blowing spots all over the place. Hart did the Goldberg angle. One thing bad about the angle is both guys laid there far too long before Hart got up, although Hart was milking the crowd to cheer him up, but Goldberg, who had never sold before, looked goofy, so overselling the knockout. I mean, even Bart Gunn got up faster than that and he was really knocked silly. Marcus Bagwell pinned Norman Smiley with the Buff blockbuster in 7:30. Buff is trying too hard to be a face and it won't work today, saying how much he loves the fans. We need to take up a collection to buy Smiley some bigger trunks. Bad match. Rey Mysterio Jr. and Billy Kidman won the tag titles from Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko in 12:25 when Raven and Saturn came out and Raven DDT'd Malenko and Mysterio Jr. pinned him. Real good match with a lot of innovative moves. The idea this week is to build the tag title around a three-way program with Rey and Kidman, Benoit and Malenko, and the new Raven and Saturn and Kenyon Freebirds-like trio. It almost always kills faces, even though that term really shouldn't exist today, to win belts when it's basically handed to them and they didn't earn it. Finally, Hogan pinned Page in 12:50. Both worked real hard and this was a good brawl, believe it or not. Hogan was very aggressive, but these guys definitely have conflicting minds when it comes to how to work a match, as both wanted to look strong at the same time, which meant neither sold well for the other. They were supposed to tear up the announcer's booth, which they really didn't, and tear down the WCW Nitro set, which they did a little bit, since they are doing an all-new set next week. In the ring, Mickey J got bumped. Flair went to hit Hogan with a chair but hit Page. Hill ref Charles Robinson ran in. Flair and Hogan went at it with Hogan no-selling Flair's spots. Hogan went to pin Page but Robinson wouldn't count. Hogan punched Robinson and finally Jay counted the pin. Ricky Rackman has signed a contract to do Nitro. The first week he was on live as a poster from a college party. The first words out of his mouth were how he didn't know much about wrestling. A sniper should have shot him at that point for all the good he's going to do once fans heard that. The last thing anyone wants to hear is an announcer who knows nothing about the subject. The May 10th Nitro scheduled for Indianapolis has been canceled because TNT will be doing an NBA doubleheader. There will be no Nitro that week. Hogan will be doing Jay Leno again on April 9th. Maybe by then WCW will have announced a main event for the April 11th pay-per-view show. Eddie Guerrero should be back in about 3 more months. They did a weird angle that hasn't been talked about much since on Thunder that aired on March 25th. Flair wrestled Wyndham for the title. It was bad enough with all the announcers talking about how Wyndham had been close but had never held the world title. He held it for 5 months in 1993, but never mentioned the long history the two had both as opponents and partners for something like 10 years. Anyway, Wyndham was playing face but nobody liked him. Flair got Wyndham in the figure 4 and this is where all logic broke down. Wyndham couldn't get to the ropes, so Arn Anderson helped Wyndham and pulled him to the ropes. So Wyndham, who so badly wanted to be world champion, simply walked away from the ring to lose via count out as the show went off the air. I defy anyone to make sense out of that one. Evidently the audience didn't care enough to make sense out of it, since the show drew a 3.07 rating, which is by far the lowest in its history and another example of the company now paying for all its booking sins of the past year. WCW Saturday Night on March 27th drew a 2.0 rating, which is also bad for this time of year. The segment on QVC on March 23rd grossed $800,000 in merchandise sales in 1 hour, which is a number so ridiculous it's impossible to contemplate. I'd guess the WWF segment after Mania on Home Shopping Network did as good if not better. Raven's sister Chastity in WCW appeared in a porno called Live Bait, which is out on commercial tape wherever tapes like that are out. Ralphus has been dropped. They thought it had run its course. Of course, this company thought the same thing about Brian Pillman and Steve Austin as a tag team. Telemundo picked up the 1-hour Spanish-language version of Nitro for another 26 weeks. After opening at 1.9, the shows has been drawing between 2.6 and 2.9 ratings, which the network was very happy with. Benoit and Malenko brought up the idea to Bischoff about going to New Japan with the tag title belts to give them legitimacy as real-world belts, and also New Japan has that dangling participle of an angle from the tournament they ran last year with the winners to get a shot at the WCW tag belts. That isn't happening. Bischoff made it clear to everyone that he isn't quitting and that he's got another 3 years on his contract. They were filming the NBC Jesse Ventura movie at the Nitro in Toronto, where most of the movie is being shot. There has been some Hollywood press about Niles Allen Stewart, who plays Ventura in the movie, and also got the part written for Goldberg in ER, having been a former pro wrestler. He may have been on a small indie level but never was a major star. He claims to have wrestled about 15 years ago. Although the Toronto crowd went nuts for Jericho as a face when he came out and Hart got the expected reaction, the crowd didn't react that way to Benoit even though he's Canadian. Weekend house shows saw March 26th in Port Huron, Michigan drew a sellout 4,153 paying $88,623. March 27th at the Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan with a loaded lineup drew 13,914 paying $427,266, and March 28th in Kalamazoo, Michigan drew 5,397, 700 shy of capacity, paying $102,398. Rick vs. Scott headlined the smaller shows. Palace show was headlined by Hogan over Flair via DQ in a title match. Goldberg was originally scheduled against Bigelow, who is out with minor elbow surgery. They had planned, although literally only a few people knew, to do the first Goldberg vs. Hart match as a replacement. However, things got screwed up as Hart was doing PR in Toronto for Nitro and was supposed to get picked up and taken to the airport, but somehow due to miscommunication within the company, his ride never came and he was waiting. As it turned out, he never showed up and some people were very upset about it backstage and Hugh Morris wound up doing the job instead. Merchandise for the week was $229,236 or $5.78 per head. Flair was really upset after the show in Panama City about the Mysterio Jr. match. As before the ratings came in, he was certain they'd be blown out by Austin vs. Giant. A correction from last week in the match, when we listed 1.5 stars, it was a typo that should have been 1/2 star. Many noted that somehow it looked like more of a size problem with Flair than when Ray wrestled bigger men like Bigelow and Nash. The reason is that Flair's style is to wrestle, and when he was mat wrestling a guy so small it looked ridiculous. With Nash, he kept away and never locked up to make it look bad and just sold flying moves and threw him around rather than doing things like collar and elbow tie-ups, which would be ludicrous. With everything going on at the shows this week in Baltimore and Fairfax, Virginia, it's already a lock that Hart, Bigelow, Nat Hall are no showing. WCW, or at least Bischoff, went to the extent of working everyone so that they had gotten plane tickets and everything for Hart to make all the shows for the next several weeks. There is nothing definite on when he'll be back, but best guess is about 2 months. WCW announced a return date for Toronto on September 1st, which in their infinite wisdom, won't be a television taping. Mark September 27th down on your calendars. WWF has a hold, and while it was said to be not quite indefinite, the current plan is to do Nitro from the Georgia Dome. Just as not quite definite but current plan is for WCW to run the new Phillips Arena in Atlanta for Nitro, so that night will probably be the biggest single war of the year. WWF. The Raw live show on March 28th at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey drew a sellout 15,213 paying $353,477. They opened with a women's dark match with Malia Hasaka over Brandi Alexander, no doubt getting a look at women for their proposed TV show. Other matches taped before the live show for either Shotgun or Super Astros saw El Merenguero, Jesus Castillo, win a 3-way over Apollo Dantes and Miguel Perez. Al Snow beat Gilbert when Gilbert crotched himself trying to jump over the ropes and fell down to be pinned. El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas beat Pantera, and the return of Takamichi Noku. Too Much won a 4-way over DOA, Public Enemy and Hardy Boys when they did a deal where immediately the other three all beat up PE and jumped on them in a pile, and since Too Much was on top of the pile they were awarded the match, and finally Draws won a squash. The live show opened with Austin asking for Vince to come out. He gave Vince the title belt he won at Mania and wanted Vince to bring him the old custom-made Stone Cold belt by the end of the show or he'd beat Vince up. Vince claimed if he touched him he'd be fired, but Austin showed a tape of Vince attacking him the previous night saying that gives him reasonable just cause to attack Vince. Vince wound up hitting Austin with the belt and running away, flipping him off as he did. Backstage, Vince and Shane argued when Vince told Stephanie to go home and get the belt. Tori and Ivory beat Sable and Jacqueline when Sable turned on Jacqueline, hitting her with the belt in 124. Sable never tagged in. It was short enough that it wasn't bad. The lights went out and Undertaker came out and the ministry surrounded Sable. Sable wasn't thinking on her feet because all she had to do was strip and she'd get anything she wanted. Since she forgot, Undertaker snatched Sable. He told Vince to come out or he'd destroy his meal ticket. Vince came out, then for some reason thought of Stephanie and ran away, and when he got where Shane was supposed to be protecting her at, she was gone. That Shane can't do anything right. Paul White choke slam test in 29 seconds. White's new catchphrase on interviews is "that's the last word." You don't have to remember it because you're going to hear it 100 times in the next 6 weeks. Bob Holly beat Steve Williams in a hardcore title match in 3:53. After a ref bump, Williams gave Holly an Oklahoma stampede through a table. No ref, so Al Snow came out and hit Williams with a frying pan and put Holly on top. Snow said that he won't let anyone beat Holly for the title unless he does. Jim Ross, who said he did the main event at Mania because Austin insisted on it, I have a feeling that's a true story, was back to playing his goofy character as he went to the Spanish table and was talking English, and they were making fun of him again. Rock pinned Billy Gunn in 5:15 with the elbow. Just about everyone cheered Rock. Hot good match. Billy pulled down his panties early in the match. Ken Shamrock beat Gangrel in 34 with an ankle lock. Good match, although they nearly both died from a mistimed Hurricane Rana. After the match they did the bloodbath spot, but Shamrock didn't sell it, and instead put the ankle lock on Christian, who spilled the beans on where Stephanie was being hidden in the basement of the building. Shamrock ended up leaving to find her while covered in blood, and eventually found her. His roaming around covered in blood playing detective was pretty funny. Ever notice Shamrock walks just like Bob Backlund of 20 years ago? They did suggest Shamrock doing an incest angle where he'd be caught basically under the sheets with Ryan. The angle was already nixed several days before it showed up on the internet. Even though Vince likes to think little children know it's all make-believe, in the real world that isn't the case, and real-life little children can be cruel on the playground if they think somebody's daddy is sleeping with his sister. Not to mention Shamrock having his gym teaching self-defense to young children whose parents probably won't be as apt to bring them to learn from a guy who is a sick pervert on TV. Not to say the angle didn't have upside potential. Goldust won the IC title from Road Dogg in 4:05 when Blue Meanie hit Dogg with the title belt. That hitting someone with a belt finish is really getting stale. Goldust did a really weird mysterious interview after the match. Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett beat LOD in 2:49 to keep the title when Jarrett hit Animal with the guitar, a metaphor for a title belt shot, to lead to the pin. So I guess we have the choice of matches with no finish, or every match having the same finish. After Stephanie was returned to Vince, let's see now. Undertaker wants to kidnap her. And he finally does. But she's already back in 2 hours. Vince didn't care about anything, unlike Shane, who didn't sell the angle at all when he was out doing color during the Rock match because it would interfere with his being too cool, and just told Shane to give Austin the belt and then went home. That guaranteed Shane wouldn't listen. X-Pac beat Triple H via DQ in 3:34. X-Pac had his mouth split open for a stiff shot. It was real good while it lasted. Chyna clotheslined X-Pac for the DQ. Chyna gave him a low blow and Triple H gave him a pedigree. The lights went out and Kane came down. Chyna distracted Kane and Triple H laid him out with a hard chair to the head, but eventually Kane sat up. Finally Rock came out with the old title belt. Austin came out as well. Austin used the stunner on Shane. Rock hit Austin with the belt. Let's see, how many times does that happen every show? And Triple H, Shamrock and Test came down and they began stomping on him until White showed up and cleaned house. Austin stunned Shamrock and White choke slammed Triple H. I figure once the cameras went off that Austin stunned everyone else in sight a few times. Big Boss Man and Mankind weren't on Raw, nor was their absence explained. Mankind was scheduled to rehab his knee and take time off after Mania. However, the commercials for the Breakdown pay-per-view on April 25th are built around him, so he's going to continue working through that show before taking time off. WWF The Music was at number 23 this week with 49,203 units sold. The Slammin' Wrestling Hits that was supposed to be taken off the market was number 163 for the week with 8,082 units sold. It's still being sold everywhere, and I've seen commercials for the CD on late-night television all week this past week. So much for a court order. The re-release of the 1993 Wrestlemania album sold 4,000 copies the first week it was out. How has WCW missed the boat not coming out with its own entrance music CD when with any promotion it's pretty well guaranteed a top 50 spot on the charts? Austin was on Conan O'Brien on March 25. He came off pretty good. At one point when the Ringmaster character was brought up, Austin said it was a stupid idea but that he had been fired by a wrestling company he didn't want to mention, WCW, and claimed he'd been unemployed for 1 year, which must make everyone at ECW thrilled, and needed the job, and talked about the character going nowhere, so he came up with the new character. Ed Ferreira, who is the assistant scriptwriter for TV and has wrestled independently in Southern California, was the plant Williams dropped on his head in Bakersfield. Speaking of Bakersfield, the house that Undertaker burned the cross on and where the Ministry was hanging out was actually a house in Bakersfield, and not Vince McMahon's house. I guess that explains why the Greenwich police didn't see anyone there. The tapings on March 30th at the Nassau Coliseum opened with shotgun matches as Williams beat Singh, Brown beat Kevin Stroller and Hardy Boys over Public Enemy via DQ when P brought in a table and the refs, who obviously don't want them around either, DQ'd them immediately. Heat opened with the Corporation coming out. Rock still had Austin's belt, and the main event on April 25th will be Rock vs. Austin for the belt with Shane as referee. Shane announced he was retiring the European title. He's learned how to manage his career from Shawn Michaels. Triple H said that he was the guy who turned the 1-2-3 Kid, Rockabilly and the new Double J into stars. Tori beat Jacqueline via DQ when Terry Runnels interfered. Venus beat Blackman, but after the match Blackman jumped Venus and beat him up with the glow sticks. Bossman, who evidently is still alive, beat Droz clean. TV Main saw Kane beat Jarrett and Hart via DQ in a handicap match when Jarrett hit him with a guitar. X-Pac ran in to make the save but Kane turned on him and left him laying with a choke slam. Raw began with the big announcement saying the main event would be White vs. Rock and Triple H in a handicap match. X-Pac and Kane won the tag titles from Hart and Jarrett. Kane choke slammed Jarrett and then teased he was going to choke slam X-Pac, but instead he dropped X-Pac on Jarrett for the belts. Ivory tore Terry Runnels' top off. It wouldn't be Raw without tearing women's clothes off. Undertaker said a beautiful young woman would be sacrificed before the end of the show. Snow beat Holly in a non-title match. After the match, Williams laid both men out. Outlaws beat Edge and Gangrel via DQ when Christian interfered. Christian was acting dazed the whole time at ringside because earlier in the show Undertaker pounded his ass into grass for spilling the beans on where they were hiding Stephanie. Ken Shamrock beat Viscera via DQ but it wasn't his day, because the Ministry kidnapped Ken. Mankind beat Venus. Mankind now has 2 words for ya, beefy. Goldust kept the IC title going to a double count out with Godfather. The Ministry came out and crucified, we don't do crucifixions, they did whatever it is they do to Ryan Shamrock. Undertaker explained he couldn't get Stephanie so Ryan was the next best thing. Main event saw White over Triple H and Rock via DQ when Chyna hit White with a low blow. After the match Austin did a run-in. Syndicated radio host Mancow was on the air last week talking about WWF versus WCW. He said the WWF was so much more professional but cited Jimmy Hart as the exception in WCW. He said with WCW, you never know if the guy scheduled will even call in, and if he does call in, you never know if he'll be in any kind of condition to be put on the air. Super Astros starting on April 11th will be moved up to the 11:30 a.m. time slot on Univision from its former noon slot. There had been talk of it going to 60 minutes but Univision and WWF were unable to come to a financial agreement to expand the show. Indications we've gotten from various sources are that Titan has lost interest in Super Astros and is more interested in the potential of using the new women's show which hasn't been finalized, but is planned for September on UPN. The contracts the women have been offered are significantly higher than what the luchadores under contract are earning, which is another example that they are more serious about this as a project. It is believed WWF and Univision are under contract to produce a weekly 30-minute show through November, but that Univision is happy with the demographics. It draws very well with teenage and early 20s males, which is an audience Univision is desperate to attract. Paul Ellering is back with LOD. Like Anybody Cares. And what happened to Hawk's program with draws? That's almost like a WCW angle. The cleavage mailbox is apparently going to lead to one of the headbangers, I think Thrasher, being given a new gimmick as Beaver Cleavage with a sexy mom named June. I just hope they don't try an inbred angle out of that one. There is talk of the other headbanger doing a clown gimmick with a new-look Bruce Pritchard as his manager. There was no mention of Bart Gunn on Raw the next day. Also talk of Shawn Stasiak's gimmick as being a sex slave for PMS. Weekend ratings saw Live Wire at 2.0, Superstars at 2.0 and Heat at 4.67. I'd figured Heat would draw its all-time record coming before Mania, but figured wrong. If you figure 200,000 West Coast buys for Mania, which probably isn't far off, Mania probably cost Heat 0.25 ratings points, so even including West Coast potential viewers, it's still slightly lower than a few recent ratings of the show. The WrestleMania Rage Party drew a 1.86 rating and 3.3 share. It had a good look to it. It was wrestlers doing interviews building up the show, plus music with Isaac Hayes, Big Punisher and a few others, Shane's goofy friends getting to dance with Deborah and Terry Runnels and act like stars, and Patterson and Briscoe trying to get into the building by dressing up as a horse. Supposedly Pat farted in Jerry's face, and as two of Godfather's hoes, and you can imagine how strange they looked as old women in drag. Deborah McMichael and Steve Austin's ex-wife Jeannie Clark, if you think about it, look almost exactly alike. The March 28 New York Times had 3 huge articles about pro wrestling in the arts and leisure section. The major story by Jeff McGregor, complete with a huge color photo that appeared to be shot during another lifetime of Papa Shango putting a nerve hold on Bret Hart, was one of those annoying highbrow pieces looking down on wrestling that substitute for the reporter doing any research portraying wrestling with terms like genially moronic synopses, whatever that means. It did look down on mainstream media wrestling coverage. Most of the coverage of the wrestling phenomenon coos and bubbles over its financial successes, but then clucks its tongue at the very nature of the product. Wondering whether children will emulate this behavior seems a little disingenuous at this late date. Of course they will, just as they did with the Power Rangers and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Davy Crockett. Expect several stories in the next year from the playgrounds of America delineating the rash of injuries that result from Pee-wee atomic drops and flyweight suplexes inexpertly applied. It finishes up talking about how lowest common denominator bad entertainment always attracts the largest and most impressionable audiences. A second story by Edward Rothstein talked about how literary critic Roland Barthes once wrote about French pro wrestling. It was another intellectual story that actually never even talked about pro wrestling other than it had a photo of Hogan. Finally, Neil Strauss wrote about what Rock could learn from the WWF. I think he meant rock music, not what Dwayne Johnston could learn from joining the circus. It talked about last year's WrestleMania. It said modern pro wrestling combines pieces from Japanese anime, P.T. Barnum circus, Cold War politics, Rocky movie vaudeville, Shakespeare and Mexican lucha libre, as if Mexican pro wrestling was a legitimate art form while American or Japanese pro wrestling isn't. It credited Kiss with coming up with a lot of the marketing ideas, which has some merit. It said that rock music tries to talk itself too seriously while rap filled with wrestling personas like Big Pun and Old Dirty Bastard is taking over the market. The Philadelphia Daily News ran a huge 2-part feature building up Mania. It was the same stuff you've heard about every week. They had an 18-year-old compare WWF to WCW, who said neither he nor his friends watched WCW. It's like in slow motion. Who would you rather see, flabby 50-year-old men choking each other or younger guys jumping from the top of the ropes? Sometimes people give the most simple and obvious answers. 2 summers ago, when WCW began to take over the young audience from WWF, that was exactly what kids on the beach used to tell me why they liked WCW. Because WWF was like watching wrestling in slow motion. WCW had no idea what got them to the top, thinking it was all the big slow older guys, and then they became the big slow old guys promotion, which is death in a modern changing world. In his latest change of face, Vince said we don't want them, as in 12 and under kids, to watch late night prime time. It's not written for them. That's 15% of our audience at 12 and under. I'd rather do without on Monday nights. Bischoff noted the hypocrisy of that statement because he markets so heavily to children. The article did note WCW started this, actually ECW did, but WCW copied first. The writer ended up defending WWF's in the same offensive elements in WWF programming can be found any time of the day, flipping the dial, noting Springer airs in the morning, Pam Anderson's VIP airs during the day, as do reruns of Silk Stockings and Law and Order. The New York Times also reported on March 24 that the WWF was expected to sign a lease for a WWF Raw restaurant in Times Square on Broadway and 43rd Street, across the street from where ABC plans to open new studios for Good Morning America. WWF had failed on several attempts to lease space in the area because landlords didn't want them in the area because wrestling was considered lowbrow. WWF will have to pay Planet Hollywood, which owns the space, $8 million plus $2 million annually for rent, and it would cost another $4 million to complete the restaurant and theme complex. Theme restaurants, big a few years ago, are dying now, but this is an entirely different audience, so there is no way of predicting how it will do. The Canadian Wire Services ran a story about a grade school principal in Nelson, BC, who sent a memo to parents after many had complained about disturbing playground incidents. First graders walking up to the girls and telling them to suck it. Because TSN doesn't have a staggered feed like USA Network, the raw feed runs from 5 to 7 p.m. on Monday early evenings. TSN spokesperson David Rosenblum claimed 80% of the complaints regarding Raw are because people want TSN is stop editing it so heavily. The readers' pages. Salaries. There has been a lot written and said about the salaries wrestlers do and don't make. Who is overpaid and who is underpaid. Obviously, a lot of contracts are based on timing and whatever the current situation is when the contract comes due. But here is what boggles my mind. The WCW payroll may not be all that outrageous compared to their overall income, but the distribution of some of the money is questionable, namely the salaries of stars such as Lex Luger, Rick Steiner, and Steve McMichael. Why can a guy like Luger get a big money extension when after 10 plus years, he's proven that he can't draw a dime of his own, let alone he has no work rate? Guys like McMichael and Rick Steiner don't bring anything to the table, but they all get new deals and some of them pretty nice. Guys like that don't even seem to care, let alone put forth effort in the ring. Guys like Sting and DDP at least have potential, so their salaries can at least be debated. But the guys in the middle like Chris Benoit, who get semi-pushes because they have mid-level contracts, need to be justified. Luger, who earns twice as much, in reality, doesn't draw one dime more. Luger and Benoit are just an example of overpaid and underpaid, and I use them to make a point. The point is, if you have guys who supposedly can't draw because they're too small, but aren't pushed or paid more than big slugs who also can't draw, at the very least they should make equal money. In the WWF, mid-card guys like X-Pac and Jeff Jarrett may not be able to draw on their own either, but they're pushed in a manner where they are at least allowed to mean something. They give it their all every time out. Anyone who can legitimately draw will always be underpaid. Guys like Benoit, Malenko, Kidman, Guerrero, X-Pac, etc. may never get the chance to succeed or fail as draws, and will also always be underpaid. Guys that are 6'6", 280 and up, will almost always be overpaid and given chances. I'd also like to comment on whether Manami Toyota deserves considering for Wrestler of the Decade. She definitely deserves a vote, but not in the top 5. From 1990 to 1995, she was awesome. From 1996 on, she struggled just to be good as the promotion surrounding her has died a slow death. She has failed to upgrade her wrestling or change her style. Wrestler of the Decade to me means someone who was on top for all, or at least most, of the 10 years. Mitsuharu Misawa and Jushin Liger have been able to adapt new styles as they went along to remain on top. Bret Hart has the luxury of working a style that kept him at the top and maintained most of his heat at the same time. But how does the last year affect his status? Shawn Michaels had a great run at being arguably the greatest performer of them all before his body called it a wrap. Most of the time he was at or near the top. Kenta Kobashi was probably the most consistent great worker of the decade, but he never was the top guy in his promotion. Steve Austin is having the greatest run of anyone over the past 10 years. Misawa, Liger, Hart, Michaels, Austin and Kobashi should be the top candidates. People like Toyota, Mick Foley, Vader, Shinya Hashimoto and Undertaker, for maintaining the gimmick for so long at the top, should round out the list. Bret Hart said in his movie that the WWF murdered the Hitman character. I guess WCW has spit on the grave. Tom Reese. Lansdale, Pennsylvania. McMahon. I'm writing in regard to your lack of credit given to Vince McMahon for his performance on the February 14th pay-per-view show. While you did say it was a better performance than anyone could have expected, I didn't think you gave him the credit he deserved. Had it been Ric Flair taking the bump off the cage, you would have written 2 or 3 paragraphs praising him for taking such a bump at this stage of his career. Instead, you put more emphasis on McMahon's ego for coming out after Austin and saying the bump gave him a 4-minute rest. Michael Otten. Coventry, Rhode Island. Response from Dave Meltzer: if Flair took a bump like that, I'd write about how pathetic it was that a great wrestler has to risk an injury taking an unnecessary risk like that at this stage of his career, and I'd already wrote something similar about Misawa taking what was a different and maybe bigger risk in the cow at a title change match. It was fine for Vince McMahon because he was only going to wrestle once or twice in his life anyway and needed to do something to make the match because he's not a skilled enough wrestler. And how could he be since he'd never done it before? to get the rise out of the crowd and cover for stretching the match out for 20 minutes without being able to actually work inside the ring. I'm just glad he didn't hurt himself, and it did take guts, but it's not like anyone couldn't climb a fence and let go. There's a huge difference between high-risk athletics where injuries can occur and non-athletic stuntman work, even if the latter is becoming an integral part of the profession today. As a fan, I have great admiration for people who can do things in the ring, or out of the ring, that I myself am not a good enough athlete or performer to do. I have little admiration for people doing things in the ring that I myself could do, but aren't stupid enough to do, because at that point it becomes nothing but a carnival geek show, and there are forms of wrestling today nowadays that are nothing but that. And if they can survive, more power to them, because ultimately the public chooses the direction this business goes. But I can't admire them because what skill did they learn to be admired? Mexican wrestlers. I agree that the Rey Mysterio Jr. Billy Kidman match on March 15th was the best match on television so far this year. But it probably would have been even better if they didn't put in the commercial break in the middle of the match. Can't they plan the breaks better so as to not interrupt the flow of the match? I've noticed this happens quite often on Nitro, especially during the matches involving the Mexican wrestlers. To me, this is just another sign of disrespect. I never recall commercial breaks during Hogan or Nash's matches. As for the WWF, 30 minutes isn't enough time for the Super Astros show to get the guys over to American fans. I understand the luchadores not appearing on English WWF programming so as not to become jobbers for the Americans, see WCW. At least they can put them on a pay-per-view match for themselves, especially if they put on El Hijo del Santo or Max Mini, who both get good pops from the crowd. This would make for a good opening match on a pay-per-view show, since the WWF undercards are usually weak anyway. What is it about Mexican wrestlers that American bookers don't give them the respect and push they deserve? Is it their culture or lack of size? It's too bad because they are some of the best workers in the business. By the way, I think Maria Felipe is really hot. Do you know her background? Erwin Markowitz, Brooklyn, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: most bookers have only seen American wrestling. Since lucha style looks different to those who have only seen American wrestling, it looks really bad because of the difference in how bumps are taken. Once you've seen it and have what I call lucha eyes, you can then appreciate the guys who are good. None of the American bookers have seen enough of it, nor have most of the American fans, and if a foreigner doesn't get over real big in a hurry, they're going to be a jobber. As for WCW, there is also the situation where you have older wrestlers who can't do much, and they don't want a new style that they can't do to get featured or exposed as being anything to be taken seriously. Ventura. Jesse Ventura was at Madison Square Garden on February 23 for the game between the Knicks and the Trail Blazers. Michael Kay, the sideline reporter, asked Ventura what his fondest Garden memory was. Ventura mentioned when he sold out the Garden for a title match with Bob Backlund. As a wrestling fan for the past 29 years and a native New Yorker, I don't recall a Backlund-Ventura sellout at the Garden. Can you please provide details of that match? I can't imagine those two could have had an epic bout. Neil Baker. Brooklyn, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: Backlund and Ventura wrestled twice in early 1982 at MSG, with Ventura winning on DQ and Backlund winning the rematch clean. Both shows drew about 15,000 fans when MSG was set up for 20,225 for wrestling, which was well below average, 18,000, for what the monthly WWF shows at the Garden, always headlined by Backlund, were doing in that era, so Ventura was a below-average main event he'll draw in WWF. In 1984, a scheduled Hogan vs. Ventura MSG match, which never took place because Ventura was taken ill 2 days earlier and John Studd subbed, did sell out MSG.